is actually old tech. When something gets discovered, it's often experimented on, exhausted, and drained by governments and militaries long before it reaches the public. This isn't some conspiracy, it's fact. I know this because I'm one of the people tasked with development on things that are beyond what's currently public. My team and I were sent to a small country in Africa. It was a small state that was not on any public map. This made things easy to deny, and made hiding the less ethical projects much easier. It was decided long ago to never give the country a true identity. Its name changes every few years, so if 2 generations of workers decided to become whistleblowers, it'd sound like they were talking about 2 completely different things. Much harder for the tinfoil hats to piece things together. Some of the team jokingly nicknamed the place Wakanda, a current reference, and again, would be harder for conspiracists to take seriously. One of the top priorities we had was never letting the outside world get a whiff that we had an entire population secretly used for experimentation. Their whole existence was a lie, completely separated from the real world, observed carefully by the many outside forces that worked there under a shared agreement. The plus side was that they lived a life of luxury. They were the first to get all the beneficial technology we worked on, tech that you're probably looking forward to seeing a decade from now, just handily available in their shops. I'm pretty sure they haven't had to touch a steering wheel in years, their streets looking like a less exaggerated interpretation of a sci-fi movie set in the future. Though this balance was sometimes superseded by the less than beneficial ideas in the works. It's pretty much universal opinion to be opposed to the idea of human experimentation. But realistically, there are many examples where testing on a small sample group of people could have prevented disaster. A perfect example of this was the rushed use of Agent Orange, a nerve agent used as a weapon. However, the long-term effects were not tested, and the repercussions of its use is still prevalent in the areas it was used. There are some examples that you'll never know about too. Did you know we found what was essentially a cure for cancer? It worked great for the first decade. However, after that, something came back. It wasn't cancer. It was worse, and it was contagious. Can you imagine if that was rushed to shelves upon discovery? We calculated a fifth of the population would have remained, namely nomad tribes far away from civilization. The experiment I helped lead had an ambitious goal. The idea conceived was to genetically enhance individuals for the benefit of society. The perfect genetics we found for imbuing the volunteer was that of an ant. With an ant's bolstered strength, enhanced constitution, and abnormal stamina, they would be the perfect workers. Manual labor injury and fatality rates would drop to nearly 0, plus the added healing factor would make the few injuries negligible. It wouldn't just be for work either. Their quality of life would improve drastically as well. Extended life, the energy to enjoy life, a massive reduction in genetic diseases like dementia and such. You just be yourself, but better. No matter what, the procedure would always physically change their appearance somewhat. The hybrids would develop small points behind the skin on their forehead, their bodies trying to replicate antennas. Their back and upper torso would swell, their frame accommodating their extra functions and strength. They also grew smaller bumps around their ribs, their bodies attempting to grow additional limbs. The biggest indicator of a hybrid is their skin. which would tint slightly with a dark purple hue. There were a number of positive benefits that we never fully calculated for. The hybrids no longer needed to breathe entirely with their mouth. The subjects started taking on the property of partially breathing through their skin, something which greatly helped the deep cave miners, the precious rocks they dug up being crucial to funding the offsets of our research. Our rocketing profits was an indicator of the continued success of the program. Minus the unwanted extras, for the most part, it was a success. However, it didn't take long to find a few bugs in the program. Something we didn't initially account for was the aggression. This, plus their amplified strength, caused a few caved-in skulls at a bar and a warpath that was only stopped by some heavy firepower. This wasn't an isolated incident. Despite the many setbacks, we were proud that, underneath it all, our subjects retained their humanity and memories. Our goal was to upgrade the human race, and it looked like it was becoming realized as a success in our eyes. With each praise of success that spread across the city, the more volunteers we received. We had it to the point where we were performing the procedure on a large test group every day, confident in the safety of it all. These volunteers naturally joined our workforce and turned into a small union of hard workers. They didn't mind the labour, as in their enhanced state, what was once a grueling grind was now a brisk task. Imagine getting the wage of a dangerous job like working on an oil rig, when it just felt like you were flipping burgers at McDonald's. The hybrids were laughing down their sleeves to the bank. A small team of hybrids could outperform a legion of an army of ordinary human workers. I was proud. During my stay, I made friends with a local. I snuck him some contraband communication equipment that could only receive and send calls to a device only I owned. Basically, a glorified walkie-talkie. If I were to give a civilian in that country any sort of outside communication, they'd have my head. And that's not a figure of speech. I knew I wouldn't be kept in that city forever, and would be called back home to work more inland. If I was called away, everything here would then fall into confidential territory, and I'd never know how things fared when I'm gone. So I set this up as a way to secretly keep up with my baby project, which I cared so deeply about. Sadly, that time came sooner than I thought. One of the hybrid workers was hanging out in a small town on the outskirts of the closed-off country, which sometimes hosted some of the surrounding tribes that didn't adhere to any of the societies. They thought they were free. However, they were really just another harbour demographic for experimentation. Like before, a bar brawl broke out. It was normal for them to fight out their differences, the local belief that if you won a fight, their god favoured your opinion more. But as you can imagine, this was different. Our worker got into an altercation with one of the tribe's daughters. In private, he ended up ripping off her jaw and beat her to death with it. It wasn't hard to figure out the connotation of what happened and the obvious ramifications of his actions. The tribe declared war on our city. We knew it was political, and more a gesture that would warrant diplomacy. But the higher-ups prioritized us over them, and ordered an immediate evacuation of most scientists and important figures. They told us our work here was done anyway. The only positive takeaway was that the experiment was marked as a massive success. A few months at home went by with no word, and suddenly I was barraged with contact. They personally told me they wanted me to head the task of making the product commercially viable. Despite the long time of silence, they were now practically trying to rush it out of the door. Their goal was that they wanted it to be open for anyone who volunteered. It seemed like an easy thing to sell too. Want to never be tired? Want to always be in shape without having to slave away at a gym? Want to be the safest you can possibly be in your own skin? The marketing team was having a field day at how easy this was going to be to sell. I was obviously excited. My hard work, years of study, years of working within this organization from the bottom up, years of working hard to get them to trust me, years of my life dedicated to wanting to help humanity was finally going to pay off. People dreamed that humans' next steps were in the stars, but I was going to show everyone it was within us the whole time. Work was hard. I helped tweak the formula for mass production. I even secretly cranked down the potency somewhat to hopefully alleviate any type of enhanced aggression. We were already on the testing process when I started feeling nostalgic about my first run in Africa. Upon contact, rather than the warm welcome I expected, I was instead met with a frantic rambling. He sounded like he was still moving and was trying his best to be as quiet as possible, but he managed to get enough out to explain what happened. It turns out, after we left, they carried on testing effects I never accounted for. The hive mind. Behind my back, another smaller team was siphoning information from my research to recreate the same process, but with a queen ant. When the tribes declared a war, it gave them the excuse to try out a crueler intention of my work. What's worse was that it was a resounding success. All at once, anyone with a modification stood to attention and moved as one to converge. Imagine the perfect soldiers, all as one, all enhanced beyond human limitations, all following the omniscient command of a single leader. The tyrannical implications was disgusting. It didn't end there. After they wiped out the tribe at a disturbingly sinister pace, they then were set upon the city. Slowly, the team of workers, now scarily efficient killers, quickly made their way through the streets. They were upon the walls, climbing through the windows of the unbeknownst civilians. Only few got away, but they have nowhere to go. The whole country surrounded with many kill conditions to always keep them out of contact with the outside world. What remained was a city of ants. It wasn't hard to piece together what happened, why ants were chosen, why they somehow developed extra features I never accounted for, like antennae and thicker, near-bulletproof skin. The objective the whole time was to make the most effective soldiers. Or worse, the perfect subservient population. I still showed up to work, now secretly armed with this knowledge. I kept my head down, and suddenly, there was an announcement that there was no tested negative side effects, and the product was almost ready to be sent out. This announcement was done by the person who managed the whole team, the one who built up the dream team to go to the city. However, now, he appeared different. His skin was far darker. He could have tried to make the excuse it was the African sun, but that would never explain the dark purple hue it carried. He was more hunched, a feature which was overshadowed by his severely inflated upper torso. I'd seen the procedure done hundreds of times. However, I never saw inflammation that big. The only thing I could liken it to was like comparing the larger thorax of a queen ant to a regular worker ant. I knew that despite secretly tweaking the formula to lower aggression, it would mean nothing if they were simply controlled. From here on out, I can only do my part by hindering the development process. I've secretly sabotaged parts of the process, setting things back weeks or sometimes months at a time. But more and more researchers are brought in, each learning everything from the files, and each slowly getting good enough to replace me. Or worse, realize what I've been doing. Past then, it's only a matter of time before the product is announced. If it is, do not volunteer. Fight it.
Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we are going to be diving into the world of cryptids. But fear not, for we have not come alone. I have the pleasure of welcoming back the paranormal scholar in tonight's video. This is a two-part collaboration, which has even more spooky tales of cryptids ready and waiting for you on their channel when you're done here. So be sure to follow me over when this video ends to check it out. You are in for some seriously good stories tonight. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. It's been a couple of months since this happened. I live in a quiet village in the south of Germany. Next to our village is a rather large forest, with loads of hiking and biking tracks leading through it. When I was little, either my aunt or my dad took me there for walks, almost every second day. It became a habit for me to keep on going for walks throughout the forest later on in life, but that changed a couple of months ago. I usually went on walks with music on during the daytime, but one night, during the full moon and a clear sky, I felt a little brave and bored at the same time, and decided to go for a stroll. I grabbed a flashlight just in case, and my phone before I headed out. Halfway through my usual route, I was feeling happy and enjoyed my music, until I came across a little bridge that led to the forest. One of my songs faded out, but before the next one could play, I heard the most blood-curdling scream I'd ever heard in my entire life. I took off my headphones, thinking that maybe a boar or another forest critter stepped into a trap, since that happens from time to time here. But once I took a step closer half over the bridge, I heard it again. This time, closer. I turned on my flashlight and saw among the trees next to the entry path a snow-white, skinny as hell, pitch black-eyed face staring straight at me. I've never felt this horrified in my entire life. My insides told me that if I were to take another step, I'd be dead. I didn't care for what was to happen, as I turned around and ran in the other direction, and went straight home, with a constant feeling of dread in my neck. Ever since then, whenever I'm home alone, I feel watched and uneasy. On several occasions, I've even heard footsteps outside on our porch, and garden chairs pushed around. I have no clue what I've seen or what to do about it. Any explanation on what the hell that thing that was hunting me was will certainly be appreciated. Halloween night of 2014. I was coming home from a party at about midnight-ish to my parents' house. The house sits back about 15 to 20 feet from the road where I had to park. Parents are out cold by the time I got there, so the house is completely dark. As I lock up the car and start making my way towards the front door, a very open yard, with few bushes and one large evergreen tree on the left side between the neighboring yard, I notice a tall, 7 to 8 foot, white/blue, hazy figure, standing behind the trunk of the evergreen. It appeared to be almost peering out from behind it, somewhat human in form and featureless, except with the exception of its very long arms, legs, and fingers. Thinking it's the neighbor's Halloween deco, I pause for a moment to study it, when I notice its head cock from one side very rapidly, as if it was studying me. Stunned, I freeze, keys in hand, as I'm watching this thing take 3 large strides and run behind the house, which is about 10 feet from the tree. The way it moved is what gets to me. It was like someone pulling back a rubber band and snapping it into hyperspace. Mind blown. No trace of it after that, though I felt watched and fearful of any windows in the house for the rest of the night. I'll preface this by saying my approach to paranormal things in life is to be open-minded until proven otherwise. So for full disclosure, I do believe in almost everything paranormal, but I've never actually seen anything worth noting myself, other than when maybe we saw a Bigfoot in Oregon back in 2012. But I was pretty far away, and it could have just been a distant bear or even a tree. Anyway, I am a single dad. My son was born in 2010. I like to think of myself as a very dedicated father. He is by far and always the best thing in my life ever, and as such, where he's involved, my memories are usually clear and more profound. Since the first time he ever slept in a bed with me, I can recall odd things happening during sleep, and it's every time that he sleeps in bed with me. Noises, blurry visions, and I wake up from such noises. A window or a door open that I knew was closed, a nightlight unplugged and on the floor, stuff like that. Well, yesterday, he was sick, and I let him sleep with me in my bed last night. I recently switched to overnight shifts at work, so when I'm off now, I've become a very light sleeper during normal sleep hours. The last thing I remember before dozing off was that my son had kicked off his blankets. He prefers to sleep that way, and I think this detail may be important, and that his pillow had kind of shifted towards the headboard, and his head wasn't on the pillow at all. This morning, a little before 4, I awoke to a noise. Only this time, I actually saw something. As I sat up, I noticed my bedroom door is open, and I never leave it open. As I'm noticing this, my focus becomes clearer, and I swear that along the doorframe I can see 4 very long fingers. Not claws, fingers. As I moved to get out of bed, the hand moved away, and I see what I can only describe as a fleeing tail. As soon as I get to my door and look into the next room, there is nothing. I searched everywhere. Nothing still. All doors were locked, as were the windows. When I go back to check on my son, the pillow is back perfectly under his head. The blankets were pulled up onto him, and the fever he had broken. He was sleeping peacefully. I have never, including this morning, felt threatened by what I have seen or heard. In contrast, I've probably felt more at ease than I should have in this situation. A couple of notes. I've always had, and still do have, dogs who sleep in the room with me. They never even barked or growled. I do have a history of sleep paralysis, though I can always tell when it's been an episode, just by how terrifying they are. I don't think this is what the situation was. And finally, I don't drink at all, and if I ever do anything, it's maybe smoke a joint when I go camping with my high school buddies. The question is, should I be concerned? Are there such things as sweet cryptids that watch over your children? Does this sound like something any of you have heard? Or is this some sort of subconscious thing I'm experiencing? Any information would be valued. So this happened about 2 years ago now. I was biking on the Panhandle Trail, and this specific instance was just across the Pennsylvania-West Virginia border, on the West Virginia side. I had been biking since morning and stopped for water. I had just crossed the border, and after a few more miles decided to turn back. As I was riding, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something off, so I stopped to look. About 40 yards off the trail, up fairly high on a tree, there was this thing. The only way I can describe it is that it looked like a 4 or 5 foot tall owl, but still a bit off from that. Slightly more humanoid actually, which is what made me think to tell you guys about it. It was sitting in this tree facing me, kind of bobbing its head up and down, almost as if it was sizing me up. Perhaps that's just my mind getting to me more. I'd thought that it's probably just a tar or trash bag or something stuck in the tree, but the branch it was on was very thick. I'd say at least 6 to 7 inches in diameter, and the branch was swaying along with these head bobs. It was very dark in colour. The only thing I could really make out, for more than a silhouette, was the face was darker, black, than the brown-grey that made up the rest of it. It didn't freak me out too much, because I assumed it was totally something explainable, but it certainly unsettled me enough to get me on a fast pace back home, especially as the area of the trail that I was on was very remote as far as I could tell. Like I said, I'm sure this could be explained away somehow. I don't really believe in these sort of things at all, but man, that experience has stuck with me. And that being said, not that you guys have any reason to believe some dude on the internet, this is 100% true, and I tried to give all the details I could. I hope you find it as cool as I have for the last few years. I love freaking people out with this story. There is a place in the country that I live in. I believe it might be called Bumbleghini. I'm not sure, but it is a legit place. It's small, and nothing lives there. There's a body of water but not one fish in it. No birds, no animals, nothing. It might be some old radiation thing, but who really knows the background of this place? Anyway, the town drunk used to go fishing nearby this place. Obviously not at it, because there would be no fish. And he came back to town with a story that when I heard it made my spine shiver. A lot of people dismissed what he said, because I guess he wasn't that intelligent, and he was a drunk. But he swore he was perched up on the river fishing at night, and saw a few meters down from him a pig-like figure on all fours splash into the water and swim across to the other side. He said he didn't really look like a pig, but that's the closest he could describe it to. And then when it got to the other side, it climbed out on 2 legs and walked out with the shape of a human. He swears it to be true, and I don't know. Who am I to say he's lying? Paranormal stories like this get told all the time. I've worked the night shift for a long time. One of the scariest experiences I had was when I worked at an abandoned factory. Now, apparently, the owners of the factory were waiting for some permissions to tear it down and build something new on the land. But in the meantime, it had to be protected. The job itself was simple enough and not very creepy, as we hardly ever had to go into the building. We simply had to patrol the perimeter and ensure that no doors had been opened and that no one was about. Now, something that was always a bit of an inconvenience was the fact that the toilet was about a 5-minute walk from my station. But I am a guy, and the station bordered woods that extended for miles. So oftentimes, assuming all I needed to do was a whiz, I'd just go and do my business in the woods. It's not like anyone was around to see what I was doing. Anyway, on to the story. It was your typical night, and I believe it was sometime around 4 a.m. I was just scrolling through Reddit on my phone, seeing if I can read anything interesting, perhaps immerse myself in a spooky story, when nature's call urged me to get up, and I approached the tree line, a way I had done hundreds of times. I always carry my flashlight, but the light from the small hut was enough so that I could just walk out into the darkness and do my business quickly and privately. However, upon reaching the tree line did I hear something. Now, it isn't the first time I've heard something. Most of the times it's just an animal moving around in the brush, so I ignored it as I did my business. As I'm just zipping myself up and turning around to leave, do I notice something in the tree line? Eyes. At least, I think it's eyes. I hear twigs cracking from underneath the weight of whatever this thing is, and I stare at it blankly for a moment. I whip out my flashlight and shine it directly at this thing. I don't even know what it was, but it was about 8 feet tall, brown fur, standing on 2 legs, and it was just watching me. The moment the flashlight hit it though, it covered its eyes and ran back into the tree line. I noped out of there and back into my station, locked the door, and occasionally would peep out the window to make sure it wasn't looking at me, after of course switching off all the lights. I waited in the dark listening, and didn't do any more of my rounds until daylight. I quit after that. No way did I want to encounter that thing again. I was there for a while, so I feel myself lucky to not have encountered it sooner.
I don't even know how to explain this, but I'm not the sort to believe in ghosts, devils, demons, and cryptids. But this has changed my mind drastically. I live in the countryside of the United Kingdom on a moderately busy lane and have loads of fields behind my house. Roughly 5 minutes up the road there's a hill called Coal Peak. It's about 6 fields away from my house and a 5-minute walk from the road. Me and my 2 friends would often go to the peak that overlooks our town and have a view over the Severn Bridge and a place called Stone House. They smoke weed, but I don't, so I can't blame what I saw on that. We sat up the top for a good hour, chilling and hanging out, but it was approaching 2 a.m, so we decided to call it a night. They walk the roadway down as it leads to the town where they live, but I, however, opted to walk through the fields, as I don't want to walk down the road on my own after my friends turn off. To get to the fields, you have to walk through a little forest for around 2 minutes. It was very dark that night, save for the moon and stars shining overhead. Just as I was around 2/3 through the forest, I heard sticks cracking to my left, as if something heavy was walking upon them. I glance over, presuming it was a fox or badger. I get towards the gate and open it, as it leads into the fields that lead to my house. I close the gate and start to walk, and that's when I heard something that I will never forget. It sounded like a Minecraft creeper, but a lot bigger and deeper sounding. I turn around, and on the path I can see this thing, around 6 foot tall and very skinny, with the face of a dog and horns. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I just stood there, watching it, hoping it was just going to vanish. Well, to my surprise, after about 5 seconds, it started to very slowly walk closer, closer, and closer, until it got to the gate. It was like I didn't know what to do, except just stand there. I was sweating, had red vision, and thought I was going to have an anxiety attack. I slowly walked across the field, trying to figure out what it would be. I looked back, about halfway across the field, and it was gone. I remember breathing a sigh of relief and calmed down enough to take a nice walk home. At least that's what I was hoping for. I was in the last field from my house, with my house in view, and I knew all I had to do was jump over my fence, and I was in my garden. I got to my fence and hopped over. I felt safe and secure, and was walking across my garden to get to the back door, when, all of a sudden, my drive light came on. Now this light only comes on if it detects motion, or if it's really windy and a branch sways in front of it. It wasn't windy, nor did I walk past it. All of a sudden I had this fear of getting snatched, so I quickly run over to my back door, open it, and run to my attic converted room. My skylight window looks over my drive where the light came on, and I stood on my bed and looked out the window, and that's when I saw it again. I once again see this horned creature sniffing around the cars. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't small enough to be a badger or a fox, and it wasn't a cow or anything like that. I just got into bed and watched movies until the sun came up and slept then. Ever since then, I never look out my window at night and never walk through those fields. I honestly don't know what this thing was, but it scared the hell out of me, and I won't go into my garden past 11 PM anymore.
4 or 5 years ago, my friend and I decided to take her dog on a walk in the bush behind her house. We knew the area quite well. There was a creek which we crossed and explored into a new area, up a hill and down a few old biking trails. The scenery changed quite suddenly. From the old spruce and pines came new growth of white poplar. It was quite eerie. Looking back on it though, although we didn't share it, it was obvious we were both extremely uneasy. It felt like there were eyes on us, which wouldn't be too strange as we were in a forest. There are tons of animals around. We didn't think much of it when her dog started going nuts, barking and growling. We thought it was just a squirrel, but we realized that that wasn't the case when we turned around. At the end of the trail, perhaps 90 feet away, was some lanky, tall, grey, skinned thing. I don't remember the face. All I know is that it was not an animal I had ever seen before. I know we ran, and I can't remember if it chased us. I don't know when we stopped either. It wasn't following us anymore if it had chased us. We made it home okay, and never spoke of it really after that. I never forgot, and started to believe I had just dreamt it, or made it up in my head. I asked my friend, and she remembered the exact same thing as me minus the face. This happened on the outskirts of Prince George, British Columbia, in the fall. Does anyone else have any information about a crawler in that area? This happened to me on the 27th of October this year. For some context, I'm a 19-year-old male who is currently working in Finnish military, as it is mandatory for everyone over 18 years old. In late October, our company had a shooting camp. Pretty average stuff. We go to a shooting area, train for a week doing different kinds of shooting exercises, and then return to the brigade. This one was no different. Except during this particular camp, we put few guardsmen to some major roads leading to the area to make sure no unauthorized people would enter the dangerous area. This guardsman job was actually a real blast, since if you were chosen to do it, you were put to a booth that had heating, a bunk, electricity, a fridge, and all other sorts of luxuries that other troops could only dream of while laying in their tents. Well, on Friday evening of the 27th, I almost couldn't contain my joy when I heard that I would be the one getting the last guardsman's shift on the guard booth. I would guard the place from the moment I arrived there until the next morning, when someone would come and pick me up and we would leave. I got one battle buddy with me to do the booth, so we could do shifts, allowing the other to sleep while the other guards. We arrive at the booth. It's late evening already, so me and my buddy just lay down our gear, heat up the booth and decide on our shifts. My buddy was to guard from 7 till 11, and I would continue to do it from 11 to 3, and then we would switch again and so on. I could have gone to sleep immediately, but I decided to keep my buddy company since I didn't feel tired. We ended up chatting the whole 4 hours about life and stuff. You know, the usual thing young guys talk about. The time basically flew while we chatted, and no cars passed through the booth during the whole time. Finally, my buddy's shift ended, and my shift started. He said he was tired and went to sleep immediately, so I took my place as guardsman and continued alone. At this point, it would be wise to tell you a little bit about the place we were in. The shooting area itself was dozens of kilometers in diameter, and pretty secluded, so no civilians usually bothered to come, even if it were by accident. The booth itself was located about 5 kilometers from our campsite, so me and my buddy were pretty much isolated from everyone and everything. The only form of communication we had was a radio that we could use to contact the security major if something were to happen. The place we had to guard was an X-shaped junction, one road going from north to south, and the other from west to east. Everything south of the booth was off limits to everyone who didn't have direct acceptance from the security major to enter, since it was dangerous because of the shootings and explosions that we practiced there. Now, back to my shift. The 4 hours I had to sit there in complete silence felt much longer than the 4 hours I had chatted with my friend, obviously. But I didn't complain. I actually quite enjoyed it. Looking at the snow-covered roads and forests lit dimly by one single street lamp, and the crescent moon from the cloudless sky, it was literally a perfect night for ghosts and monsters. There was no wind, no sound at all, and no cars passing during my whole shift. I loved it. I've always liked being alone, and loved silence. On top of that, I also liked everything creepy, so I kept myself entertained imagining all kinds of scary beings lurking in the forest beyond the reach of the streetlight. Not that I believed any of it, though. But I had to admit that each time I stepped out of the booth, I got this feeling of being watched. You know, the one that makes your neck tingle and the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. I didn't mind it, though. It was normal. I was a guardsman in the middle of nowhere, basically alone in the middle of the night. It was normal to be a little paranoid, though there would be nothing to fear in the forest. I've lived my whole life near them, and know really well what lies within them, and what does not. That's how I kept my imagination from running too wild. Hours passed, and my shift was nearing its end. I looked at my phone, and decided that soon would be time to wake up my buddy. But before doing that, I would go out and take a whiz. I didn't want to go to sleep and then wake up minutes later with the urge to pee, so that's what I did. I stepped out, walked behind the booth, and started doing what I came to do. All was peaceful, and I had already started to plan what I was going to do on my next vacation, when I happened to lift my gaze from the ground and took a quick glance from my surroundings. As soon as I looked to my left, directly to the south of the booth, my heart skipped a beat, and my stomach grew cold. Just a mere 20 to 30 meters away from me, in the forest, just barely lit by the streetlight, something was standing. It clearly looked human, but the sheer size of the thing assured me that it was not. The thing had to be at least 3 meters tall. It wasn't in any way strangely shaped. It looked perfectly human, but it was just huge. By the looks of it, it was wearing a long green robe-like clothing, like Sniper's ghillie suit. Its face was pale, but I could not make out any facial features. It was too far away for that, but I could tell that it was staring straight at me, and I was standing absolutely still. I didn't move a muscle, nor did I make the slightest sound. That, in particular, gives me the creeps for some reason. One curious detail that I also noticed was that it was crossing its arms over its chest, so that its hands were clutching its shoulders. That's the best way I can describe what I saw. And usually when I tell people this story, they dismiss it, and I tell them what I saw, and then I show them the evidence. I took a photo of the creature I saw. I may have been scared out of my mind, but I was still a guardsman, and my duty was to document everything that happened. After I had recovered from my initial shock of seeing this thing, I just continued staring at it, while silently I finished taking a whiz. I looked at the creature the whole time I pulled my pants up, closed them, and thought of what I would do next. The obvious answer was to pull out my rifle and confront it, but my careless self had decided to leave it in the booth, together with my battle knife and axe. I was without a weapon, face to face against this towering behemoth of a humanoid. I weighed my options and decided to get the hell out of there, but not before I took that picture. After I had done that, I slowly turned around and walked to the booth. I sat in my chair, grabbed the axe, and waited. Now you may ask why I didn't grab the assault rifle. The answer is because this isn't the USA. This is Finland, and even though we are in a military shooting camp, carrying ammo with you is prohibited, even for a guardsman. That's because here average citizens can't just carry a loaded gun with them wherever they please. So having ammo with us, when the risk of running into a hostile armed person is really minimal, would just be another safety risk. Usually just the sight of a gun, let alone an assault rifle, is enough to scare violent people into calming down. But what I had seen was no human. It couldn't have been. So now I just sit in my booth holding my axe, ready to defend myself if the creature came. But it never did. The last couple of dozen minutes of my shift went absolutely silent. When my shift ended, I immediately woke up my buddy and told him what I'd seen. But apparently he was too dazed after he'd just woken up, that he really did not register what I had just told him. I, however, didn't care. The only thing I cared for was that I wouldn't set foot outside that booth again that night, and it was my turn to rest. So I laid down, heart still pounding from the stress, and tried to fall asleep. Needless to say, it was pretty difficult after what I had seen, but eventually I fell asleep, since it was quiet and peaceful again. Though my sleep didn't last long, I woke up before my next shift had even started, to the sound of footsteps coming from the outside of the booth. I thought that it must just be my friend carrying firewood from the outside, until I realized that he had fallen asleep in the front of the guard desk. There was someone, or something, outside the booth that didn't belong there. Someone that I feared I had seen earlier. I just laid there, heart pounding. I was not going to stand to see what was on the outside. This went on for a minute, until I heard a sudden howl. At first it sounded like the wind blowing through the cracks on the wall, but then I remembered there was no wind. This howl was long and high-pitched, almost like a moan. It made my whole body freeze from terror. I had never been this scared in my life. After the howl ended, the footsteps continued for a while, until they faded too. Whatever had been on the outside was now finally gone, hopefully. Against all odds, I managed to fall back asleep, and was awoken up in the morning by my friend, whose next shift had started. I immediately remembered what happened the last night, and told my friend. At first he didn't believe me but laughed a little, but his expression grew serious once I showed him the picture I took. When we went outside, and I showed him the place where I had taken the photo, he was quiet. While we stood there, I took a second photo for comparison. My friend then walked to the spot where the creature had stood, when I saw it. My friend was about 194 centimeters tall, and he came nowhere near close to the height of this thing, further proving to myself that I had not dreamt it at all. Sadly, I have no picture of my friend standing in the same spot. I didn't think of it at the time, and after that, I brought this case to the attention of my superiors and other friends, and they were all as confused as I was. No one seemed to be able to explain what I had seen. Someone suggested that it could be a prank pulled by the other troops. I thought about it, but refused the possibility. There was no way some guys would bother walking many kilometers into the dead of night just to scare some random guardsmen. Besides, even if they did, why would they be standing south of the booth, where it was forbidden for anyone to enter? If I wanted to scare the guardsmen, I would go to the north side of the booth, where I would be detected eventually for sure. But the fact that confirms that it couldn't have been some random troops playing a prank was the sheer size of it. Even two people standing on top of each other could hardly match the scale of this thing, let alone stay so still. And then there were the footsteps and the howl. To this day I have no idea what I saw and heard that night. Was it some troop playing a prank? Some abnormally huge civilian having a long night walk in the middle of nature? Or something that science cannot explain? Before this event, I've always been a bit of a skeptic when it came to the paranormal. I'd like to believe, but it's hard without any concrete evidence. But now, when I had seen something myself, and even got proof of it, I don't know what to believe anymore. So, the Grok of Wamsaka, whatever you may have been, I hope I someday find the truth about you. My family owns a decent-sized horseboarding facility, and when we first had it going, we used to do bed checks as a family. Bed check is just making sure all the lights and fans were off, as well as looking at the horses for injuries, and if they had blankets during the winter. We had just got back from eating out, and it was a moonless night during fall. As we stepped out of the truck, this large, light grey mass stood up and took off looping towards our pastures. It was about the size of a single cab pickup truck. It made no noise other than hitting the ground as it ran. The only other proof that it was real to us was the horses that were turned out that night screamed and stamped across the pasture it had jumped into. We did a double count of all the horses that night, and not a single one was missing. I still have yet to see it again, and I hope I never do, or at least that there is some explanation for it. I used to have this recurring nightmare about this lizard man type monster, who could see what I could see out of my eyes. So I'd run and hide, and he wouldn't know where I was. But then as soon as I peeked to see if I was safe, he would know. So I'd have to leave that spot and go find somewhere else, and it would happen over and over again. A literal nightmare. But here is the real spooky part. I once mentioned the lizard man to my dad, and he got super white in the face, and his voice was all shaky and just said, "This dream took place at our house in East St. Paul, the one with the apartments right behind it." And I said, "Yeah, that's where I'd always go and hide. How did you know?" And he said, "Because I have the exact same dream." And I don't know if it was just the way he said it, or just the overall situation of both, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It's quite chilling. I've never shared this story with anyone, besides the people that were with me that night, and my best friend that claims to have seen him at a different date that I didn't know about until I described my experience to him. I lived in a small town called Bastrop in Louisiana, with my cousin and his wife. There's not much to do in Morehouse Parish besides drive back roads, like we've done thousands of times before. Then one night, in 2015, we were leaving a church that we used to clean at around 2 a.m. or so. We were in my cousin's 1990 GMC Sierra single cab 4x4. We decided to ride back roads. So as we're cruising, we're talking and listening to Nirvana. But anyway, his wife was asleep in the middle seat when we turned onto a paved road, 5 miles or so outside of town, and come around a curb, and there it was, something we'd never seen before. I'm an avid hunter, and had been in the woods all hours of the day and night. I was also in the army, but had never been more freaked out by something than what I had witnessed. There was something dead in the road, and something was eating it when the headlights hit it. It looked up, and was about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, like it was kneeling over whatever it was eating. It had red eyes, and stood up so fast it seemed like a millisecond. It was about 7 to 8 feet tall, pitch black, and its skin looked like a bat skin, but was darker, and in one fell swoop, it leapt, and its wings opened up and flew into the woods on the side of the road that it had been moving over at 50 miles an hour. It was the wildest experience of my life, and I've always been cynical when it comes to the paranormal, but I know what I saw that night, and so does my cousin.
This happened when I was a small child, probably around 4, after I had experienced what I now know as a near-death experience. I was with my grandmother, who was very healthy for her age, We went trekking across our property with a picnic basket in tow, just looking to sit down with our dog and have a nice time. Normal grandparent stuff. We ended up crossing the creek. It was dry at the time, to go to the back pasture. Nearby, probably around 50 yards away, was our cedar tree. We had sat down and started eating when our dog started acting crazy. This dog, bless her soul, was an angel. She did not act like a dog most of the time. She never barked, never jumped, and always acted polite. However, at this very moment, she went nuts, running in circles around us, growling and barking. My grandmother got concerned, so she put our picnic stuff back in the basket and tried to calm her down. I was sitting a few feet away, scared because my dog was growling and having no idea as to why. I will admit my memory gets fuzzy around here, but I vividly remember seeing a large, grey creature step out of the creek tree line that we had previously walked through. Upon seeing this too, my grandmother scooped me up as quickly as she could and ran out of there, our dog running behind us. I am 90% sure she ran to the cedar tree. She always talks about it being her favourite tree and how protective it is. The tree was a lot closer than our house, that was roughly half a mile away at this point. I just know our dog calmed down, and I was happier. I still have no clue as to what that could have been.
This happened to a friend and I a few years ago. My friend and I are both gun enthusiasts, and I had just purchased a new gun and wanted to shoot it. I live at the base of a mountain that borders the Blue Ridge Parkway. I own 17 acres, so shooting in my backyard isn't an issue. We began shooting my new gun, and my friend turns to his right and is immediately shocked and says, "Hey man, what's that?" When I turned to look, I saw something that sticks with me to this day. It was a red-eyed creature, maybe 2 feet high with glowing red eyes. I did not get a good vibe from it, and its face was terrifying. Even with a loaded gun in my hand, we approached the creature slowly, and my feeling of terror rose. My friend and I immediately turned around and went inside, and did not speak of it for the rest of the time, like we had forgotten about what happened. My friend called me the next day and asked me why we had not done anything, and both came to an agreement that this creature had influenced us in some way. If anyone has had any similar experience, please share it. Looks-wise, it was about 2 to 3 feet tall, scaly grey skin, but I was distracted by the eyes. They penetrated through me and were so intense. It must have been 20 years ago, when my brother-in-law saw what we can only describe as a lizard or reptile man. This happened in the mountain towns of Xochimilco, Mexico City. I remember it was the time when he was still dating my sister, and one night after hanging out with her at our place, he went back home. I recall it was a few minutes past 11, and he used to drive a Volkswagen Beetle, and that night he headed uphill for San Francisco where he lived. He had to take a road surrounded by trees, pine trees. To his left side was the hill, and he told us that when he got around the curve he reached a dark, rocky place. The rocks were huge and it was pitch black. He was driving very fast, as he was used to, and so he turned on his high-beam headlights. After doing it, he could see some movement from the corner of his eye, and within a few seconds, right in front of him, he saw a huge creature crossing the road in just 2 steps, which immediately reached the other side of the road, where a tall wall made out of stone was built. He couldn't say if the creature went through the wall, jumped over it, or went down some kind of ditch, but the animal disappeared. He only remembers that it was pretty tall with a humanoid form, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but had a tail. He said that if it had been someone in a costume, he would have dragged his tail, but he recalls that it never touched the ground. Instead of a mouth, it had a turtle-like beak, and since he had his high beams on, he could see it very clearly, and described the skin as greyish. I used to make fun of him for saying he'd been smoking too much weed or something, but later on, we found out that other people living nearby had also seen it. That was just about the time when 2 of my dogs went missing. One day one of them got lost while we were walking in those woods. He was walking ahead of me, and went out of sight while running downhill. I heard him whimper once, and never saw him again. When I heard it, I ran to the place I thought he had gone to, but I couldn't find him. There were houses down the hill where some dogs lived, but I never heard them bark or anything had passed by. I looked for him everywhere on several occasions. He wasn't hit by a car, and I have no clue what happened to that dog. Those were the times when we had no idea why the army used to go up into the mountains very frequently, and wouldn't let anyone else in. They were supposedly training, and a lot of soldiers camped there. And every week, new soldiers would arrive to replace the ones from the past week. We thought it was a strange coincidence, and so that's what happened. A lot of people have claimed to seeing this creature, although I never saw it. Nonetheless, whenever I went into the hills, I had this strange and weird feeling of being watched. My mum hates camping, so my dad always took me and my 2 sisters for a few days camping in the woods. It's a tradition that his father passed down to him, and he wanted us girls to carry it on too. We always went to the same woods, but there's something that happened that made us stop going. One summer, we were walking through the woods. We had deviated off the path to find somewhere a bit more private, as every year we tried to go somewhere we hadn't been before. We had been walking on the path for maybe half an hour, and it was still very bright with the sun high in the sky. That's when we heard something, rustling. At first we sort of dismissed it, but then the rustling grew loud very quickly. All 4 of us turned around, and this huge bipedal creature that must have been about 10 foot tall, I don't know, it was just running really fast, runs straight towards us. No reaction time, just pure fear. I felt like I was going to die, going to be trampled by whatever this thing was. This creature ran straight past us, and I swear I could smell it and feel the hair brush past me as it made its way across the forest. I followed it with my eyes, but within an instant, it was gone again. My father said nothing. We turned around and got our little butts back home. We didn't talk about it much. My father has never taken us to the woods again, and I don't blame him. Okay, so my first story is actually my friend's story. During the time these things took place, we were all high school students. This is all happening in Florida, by the way. I already knew about skinwalkers and the like, but when these things happened to me, I wasn't sure if it really was a skinwalker or something else. I've noticed that most of the people who tell me they've experienced the same phenomenon live in the area that I do, and my friend is no exception. My friend is called Jay, and lives about 10 minutes away from me. She told me that in her bus, there's this one area they drive by to drop this kid off. She said she doesn't know why, but it gives her the creeps. Well, she told me that one early morning, so it was still dark outside, when they were driving in that area to pick him up, all the kids in the bus and the driver saw this weird-ass deer running along the bus. It didn't run away from the bus, but ran beside it. She said it looked weird as hell. You all know the usual stuff. It looking like some humanoid deer because it just didn't look right. Like its limbs were bent in an awkward way. And she said its eyes were freaky. The thing is, my friend didn't know jack about skinwalkers or any of that mumbo-jumbo, so I basically got the chills. I tried being reasonable, because I thought that perhaps she'd just seen a regular deer, and since it was dark, there was a possibility that she got confused. Besides, it's Florida. I don't think we're even supposed to get that kind of stuff down here. However, Jay swore up and down that it wasn't like a normal deer. She said that they all saw it, and the bus driver even slowed down to get a better look, because everyone was weirded out by it, and it was basically pandemonium. After a while, it ran off and disappeared. Jay couldn't have made something like this up, because like I said before, she doesn't even know anything about skinwalkers or the goat man or whatever it could be. So anyway, I got freaked out here because I am knowing about these things, and my friend is clueless, thinking she's just telling a regular story about some freaky deer demon. So I asked her, "Do you know what skinwalkers are?" And she looked at me and said, "What is that?" I googled them and showed her the description, and she goes, "Yeah, that's what I saw, except it had the head of a deer." She kept on saying it didn't look like an animal or a human, and that after a while the kid from that bus stop didn't come back, although that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with this, unless you want to go wild with what might have happened to him. So we were freaking out together, because what she said reminded me a lot about what I heard one night, about it not being animal or human. See, a couple of years before she told me this story, I found myself one night in the backyard, like really early, perhaps 3 in the morning or so, because I was thinking about things due to personal reasons. I was just kind of chilling and enjoying the silence, when all of a sudden, I hear this really freaky-ass echoing scream from really far away. The only way I can describe it is as if a woman and a cat were trapped together inside of a bag and screaming like they were about to get murdered. I know mountain lions, foxes and owls can make the weirdest mating call sounds, and I've looked this stuff up, trying to debunk it myself, but it just didn't sound anything like those things. You usually would be able to tell if it's an animal, right? It's just common sense. Like my friend said before, that didn't sound animal or human. It sounded unnatural and weird. Now, me being me, I was pretty unfazed at first. A little concerned, yeah. But at first it was really too far away, and I just assumed it was a woman. And I actually thought that they were killing people in the streets at 3 in the morning. The thing is, that thing travelled fast. It was freaky as hell, and the closer it got, the more weird and unnatural it sounded. It only took me a couple of seconds to realise that this was no woman, and that it was no cat. Because while this was going down, I was going through in my head, what the hell is that? This thing went from sounding like it was a couple of miles away, to being in my damn neighbourhood in under 5 seconds. It was weird, because 1 second it was so far, and the next it was right on my street. I almost soiled myself. The second I stood up to leave, the scream had just stopped. Like it just dead-ass stopped. And I'm really thinking at this point it's in front of my house. So I walked as calmly as possible back inside, locked the doors, and the scream was back to being far away again. Weird as hell. I've also heard scraping and tapping on my windows some nights, usually around the same time. I'd say 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning, and I've seen dark figures that weren't affected by light outside of my house. To add detail to these things so that you can get a feel for it. Basically, what happened is that I was doing a project for class, and since I procrastinate like a pro, I'm up till 2 a.m. I go to wash my hands from all the graphite, and as the water is running, I hear scraping against one of the bathroom doors that leads to the backyard. Now, most of the door is made up of these glass panels that kind of make everything look like a bunch of blurry gloops if you try and look out of it. And for a split second, I thought I noticed something pointy and ash grey scraping against the window. It almost looked ghost-like. I turned off the water and waited a little bit, and it comes back to scraping against the window again. I'm trying not to freak out, but my hands are shaking. It's stupid, but I actually whispered, "What are you doing?" while my voice trembled. It stopped, and I didn't hear anything except what sounded like someone walking by the window in my room every now and then. It continued that way for some nights too. Off and on, I would hear footsteps by my window, and even a tap or two some nights as well. Sometimes I just ignored them, and other times I look out to see if someone was there, but there never was anyone. Another night, I had been outside in my backyard again, after having a rough day. It was maybe 3 or so in the morning, and I'm sitting outside on the trampoline just relaxing. I suddenly notice it's like absolutely quiet, like the kind of uneasy silence that almost feels like a vacuum. I get this kind of dread like I'm being watched, and I snap my head to my left and catch a glimpse of a humanoid, dark figure ducking under the other side of my fence immediately. I'm a little freaked out, because I noticed this thing was pure black. Like, the streetlight nearby didn't hit it at all. Almost like it looked cartoony, if that makes sense. Because it was like the law of physics didn't need to apply for this thing. See, the reason I'm ranting about this stuff is because I told both of my friends and my own story in my psychology class at the same school. A lot of these kids live around my area. I mean about 5 to 15 minutes away max. And they all started screaming at the entire class, and they all went crazy when I finished, because apparently they've all experienced similar things. One girl told me that she also heard tapping on her window at night and heard screaming. It freaked me out, because she explained it in the same way I did. She said it sounded like a woman or a cat, but not really like either. Another one of my friends who lives really close told me she saw dark figures in the woods and heard the screaming too. Pretty much everyone has heard the screaming. It sounded the same. That's the thing. In completely different time frames. That's what's weird, because everyone's voice sounds different. So how could she be describing the same thing I did? You all know, like if people were really killing each other out there. None of us thought it was an animal either. We all agreed from that point on that our town was haunted as hell. But I don't know. I mean, if there are any animals out there that sound like that, I want to know. Because that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before, so I want to be enlightened. The only person I've ever heard who's seen anything remotely specific is the first friend from Art, who went on the bus, and apparently it's like really bad to talk about skinwalkers, and even worse if you see them. It's like bad mojo. Those things are said to be able to travel very quickly, so thinking about that made it seem like what we experienced was a skinwalker. But to be honest, I hope there's a logical explanation that I'm not aware of. Today, I asked my co-worker, who was also a friend in high school and lives nearby too. He got all spooked and said that he's seen and heard the same things. He's very spiritual and often has visions. He told me that he believes they're doing dark magic in the woods because of a dream that he had about some hooded figures sacrificing a woman and a cat, or something like that. Which is freaky, because it also turns out that behind our local park, there's a patch of woods which is very shifty. I was shown this by an acquaintance during my freshman year who lives a couple of streets away. Down the path in the woods after some walking, there's this huge cross smack dab in the middle of the woods. It's basically raw, crooked, nailed together into a cross, with rope hanging from where you put your hands if you were getting crucified. It's huge too, and whenever I decide to check it out, I always feel uneasy. Like this feeling that if I stay for too long, something bad will happen. It doesn't look like a grave, to be honest, but who knows. Anyway, he says I'm not the first person that he knows who's told him about experiencing these things. He also had his own experiences with humanoid figures. He says he once saw one, and that it turned and looked at him directly in the eye, as if it immediately knew he was looking at it. So basically, we no longer mess around in the woods.
My friend and I were driving around the back roads of Ballard County in western Kentucky. It was around 2 a.m. I was driving and turned onto a gravel farm road. As I did, I caught sight of something white and vaguely human-shaped crawling in the ditch. As we passed it, I hit the brakes thinking it was a person who needed help. "Are you crazy? Don't stop," my friend Blake screamed. I looked in the mirror and saw that it was standing up. Even though it was still in the ditch, it was as tall as the stop sign next to it. It took a step towards us, and I just hit the gas. As we drove away, I saw in the mirror that it dropped onto all fours and was crawling after us. I didn't start pulling away from it until I got up to about 40 miles per hour. No matter how close I was to it, I never got a good look at it. It was fuzzy, like it was constantly out of focus. I'm not sure why, but something about it makes me think of it as male. Maybe the height. When it crawled, it looked like it had lizard hands and feet flat on the ground, elbows and knees up and out, body wiggling side to side. This happened to me when I was around 22. I'm 40 now, and have never seen that thing again. I've taken many a midnight cruise along those narrow roads, but I've never had the nerve to go near that particular farm road again.
About 10 years ago, me and my husband were going spelunking in a remote part of Canada, although I don't want to mention where for privacy's sake. We were using flashlights and descending into the darkness. We had been to this cave before, but we were trying to reach a chamber that we had yet to have got to on previous occasions. As we're making our way down, we hit the ground and start making our way towards where this chamber is. That's when we hear something in the cave. There really shouldn't be anything about, other than a few bats, as we're very deep down, and there shouldn't be any rodents here. Not any that could have survived the fall anyway. We try and ignore it, assuming it's still wildlife, and that's when we see something from our headlamps. A creature, tall, humanoid, grey, just running through the cave. We stand there in shock, and without even saying a word, we run back and haul us out of there as quickly as possible. We never returned to that cave. We told our friends about it, and they said that it could have very well been a hoax. But who the hell would have dressed in grey, stayed in the pitch black, just to wait for the opportune time to scare two cavers? It doesn't make any sense to me. I live 25 minutes south of Boston. About 6 months ago, I saw this insane thing. It was about 3 a.m. I had been up late, as I normally am. I stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. It was dark as hell, except for the stars and full moon. As I was smoking, I heard this noise of something flying. I look up and see this winged creature land on my neighbor's roof and just sit there like a gargoyle would. I thought I was seeing stuff, or seeing something wrong. But then the creature jumped up and flew away, and I could see its whole body. It was the size of a small human, but massive wings. It reminded me of a gargoyle. I don't know what the hell it was, but it was crazy. If anyone has ever seen anything like this, I'd love to hear your story. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. And of course, a huge thank you to the Paranormal Scholar for helping me and joining on the video. As I said at the start, this is indeed a two-part collaboration, and you can find more amazing stories over on the Paranormal Scholars channel. It would mean a lot to me if you would go over there and listen to it. You will certainly enjoy it, and it will be worth your time. And while you're there, please let them know that Mort sent you. It's always nice. So, I'll see you there. Link on screen now. There was an abandoned factory near a train station that recently had been torn down. A couple of years ago, when it was still standing, it was dilapidated and tagged all over. It looked nice and abandoned. After crossing the train track and hopping a few fences, we got to where the door once was. It was now a boarded up hole. We cranked our crowbars to get it off, and once we did, we found a huge open space, everything stripped, copper wiring and such. Everything dusty, and wooden bits rotted. It smelled dank and mildewy, and was so dark, and it seemed like no one had stepped in there for years. This factory was huge. We decided to pop out from wherever we had, and came to explore another side. Once myself and my 3 friends came out, we searched along the sides to find another entrance. Then, the flashlight pointed at us. Shit! The cops. Goddamn, I don't need a trespassing charge. Then, oh shit, he has a gun. I wish this was a cop, and threat of a charge. We were huddled behind a hunk of scrap, and he was bellowing for us to get out. The fear I felt at that moment was unreal. Shaking, clammy, we stepped out. He pointed this bright-ass flashlight at us. His demanding voice went from a low growl to a more frantic, pissed-off one. Who the hell are you, and what are you doing here? Do you know where you are? One of us, the calmest in our misguided Scooby gang, said confidently that we will leave and never return, and to please allow us to. He said to walk us out, which was less walking us out, more so blinding us with his flashlight, and directing us to jump the fences and walk away, with his gun pointed at us. Having my back turned towards this weapon-wielding man was terrifying. My option was to do what he said, and hope that he wouldn't shoot. The obvious one. But having to trust that he wouldn't mess us up while vulnerably climbing the chain-link fence in the dark will always stay with me. I don't know if there were people maybe taking meth, or what was being done in that factory by its apparent occupants. It's gone now, but that memory gives me chills whenever I pass there. I have a few more instances with abandoned places, but this was the most traumatizing. On another occasion, the same group of friends and I would visit this big, multi-level building that was up in the mountains. It was supposed to be a rec center or country club, but it was stopped in the midst of construction because of the outdated and hazardous materials being used. I believe this was because of asbestos, and a building was built elsewhere, but this one remained because of financial reasons. On the drive to get there, you pass by some beautiful mountain homes, and then up a half-mile-long dirt road, but without any lights on, as not to disturb the neighborhood. We would go into this concrete and metal structure late at night, breaking open glow sticks and flinging them around the rooms, and spray painting and other kid shit. We frequented it until this incident. The group that had gone there was smaller than our usual, 4 or 5, and was just me and 2 other friends. We were equipped with a lantern, a flashlight, and just going to hang out. The entrance were these huge metal doors. They were extremely heavy, and it took the 2 of us to push very hard to move them even a little bit. They were always open. Everything looked normal. Usual amounts of cigarette butts and general trash. Doors open, no other cars or anything around. Everything looked as if no one was there. We entered into a room about the size of a bedroom. That is directly to the right. This one is so dark and small compared to the vast open spaces of the lower levels. So naturally, the most fun to spray glow sticks and have glow-in-the-dark shit in. There is a comically creepy book that is a pretty old children's book sitting there. It's about Mother Goose and tells little tales that we've all heard. The illustrations are super weird looking. Anyway, who doesn't love getting scared? So one of my friends picks it up, because we're into this creepy book that we found and are probably going to keep it. We keep walking around the inside and hear squeaks and screeches. This is in the mountains, and this is an old building. Whenever we heard noises, our minds go to 2 places. It was either 1, an animal or bug, or a clanky piece of metal, as these things were heavy, or 2, we are in an abandoned place at night. Anything heard is going to be scary. We all smoked at the time, and went outside to the stairway that goes into a hole where there is a locked door, sat on the stairs, and smoked. We heard a little high-pitched scream that almost sounded like it could be from a magpie. It creeped us out, and then we began to hear rustling and some sort of soft clomping. Very rhythmic. Almost seemed to be too much for people walking. But probably there was another person here. So we decided to scope it out. We carefully walked the perimeter, but see no people, no cars, nothing indicating that someone else would be there. When we walked to the entrance, my friend jokes that the book is haunted and causing these disturbances. She says that she'd better give it back to the ghost so it won't get mad or something, and throws it towards the entrance. It lands, opens, and flips a couple of pages. The night was still very still, not breezy or windy, and we started to freak out. We feel a little unsettled and unsure if we should go back in. We also lost our lighter, so we only had our flashlights, as we couldn't light our lantern anymore. Then, this huge creak. One of the doors is shut. How that happened without us hearing is beyond my comprehension, as we would have definitely heard it. It's extremely loud. The other door This heavy-ass door that is damn hard to move even one bit is closing on its own, fairly quickly, and glides shut with a loud bang that makes us all jump. We booked it at that point, ran into the car, and never went back. It doesn't seem that scary to recount, but damn, when I think about what I saw, I feel sick. I have horrible nightmares about this place, when the outcome is much more grisly, so that doesn't help. It was my first night in a new city, and I called my mother to tell her that I had arrived safely. She tells me that the girl I dated when I was 17, as I was now 23, and hadn't heard a peep out of her in 5 years, called out of the blue looking for me and left her lumber. Lonely and bored, I rang her up and had a strange catch-up session. She told me she was engaged to a woman, and that her life after we broke up was a series of unfortunate events. We hung up on pleasant terms, with no plans to keep in touch. 3 days later, I am exiting my building, and who is standing there in the rain, waiting? Yup, her. She had flown 2,500 miles in the middle of the night because she thought we were destined to be together. She told me how she was so torn up about us not being together that she had pulled out all of her pubic hair. She also bought her fiancé, who was as crazy as she, and was urging my ex to have a baby with me. I calmly tried telling her that this was insane and that I had no interest in any of this, when out of nowhere it all goes black. I wake up to chaos, and my doorman is holding the fiancé down waiting for police. Turns out, she'd hit me on the back of the head with a full bottle of champagne that they'd bought to celebrate with us. Arrests were made, and restraining orders followed. A few years back, my husband and I were living in an apartment in Brooklyn. One night, we decided to check our neighborhood sex offenders registry, and we discovered that an offender lived in our building. Not a big deal to us, as we didn't have any children at the time, but I should mention that this guy was one creepy looking dude, and I'm talking about wild hair, crazy eyes, and a creeper. We would see the guy walking around the building or neighborhood every now and then. He even set up fruit stands for a while, and would wildly yell at people as they passed by. He never bothered us, so we mostly didn't think about him. At the time, I was working a crazy job, where I would be at work really late every night, and have to take a taxi home. On those nights, my husband would stay up late, and wait for me to get home. I was also a bit brain dead when I would get home after a 20-hour shift, so sometimes it would take me a while to find my keys, and my husband would have to let me in. One night, I had texted that I was leaving the office at around 3 a.m. About half an hour later, my husband heard our door handle jiggling. Assuming it was me, he got up to let me in. However, something made him look out the peephole first, and there he saw him, the sex offender, completely naked, standing outside the door. As soon as my husband looked out, the guy stopped jiggling the handle, looked up, and put his eyeball right up to the peephole to try and look in, as if he could tell if someone was looking out at him. Then for some reason, my husband opened the door. As soon as he did, the guy tried to force himself in the apartment. Eventually, he got the door closed and called me. I was about a mile away from our building when I received the call, and I was terrified. It must have been obvious, because when we got to the building, the taxi driver asked if he could walk me to the front door. I told him yes, and that I would appreciate it, and he stood with me until my husband came from outside to walk me in. We lived on the 6th floor, and from the moment we walked in, you could hear someone running up and down the staircase. We ran to the elevator and jumped in, pressing the closed door button over and over until the elevator started to move. When we got to about the 3rd floor, the floor where the sex offender was at the time, he began banging on the elevator doors, trying to get in. And then we heard him go to the stairs and start running up the stairs to catch us. When we got to our apartment, we called the cops and reported the terrifying situation. It took them 2 hours to arrive, and by that time the guy had already picked up his clothes and gone home. The cops didn't even come inside the building. They made us go outside and didn't even get out of their cars. When I explained what happened, they responded by saying, "You live in Brooklyn, get used to it." Eventually we moved out of the building, but whenever we go back to that neighborhood, we still see the guy at his fruit stand, yelling at people walking by. A few years ago, I was backpacking in Eastern Washington with some friends of mine. I don't know how well you guys know Eastern Washington, but it's pretty much dust, sagebrush, and dirt. We decided to hike up on top of this canyon, and from there, you could see miles and miles of straight nothing. After a few hours of traversing the top of the cliff, we eventually found a little crevasse that kind of took us a little ways underground into a pretty decent-sized cave. The cave was filled with little bones, like mice and bats. In one of the corners of the cave, there was a rock fixture that jutted up from the ground and almost made a separate room. In the room, we found lots of scratches on the walls, photographs, and 3 bottles with notes in them. While this was kind of off-putting on its own, we figured it was just some sort of joke, and we'd find a silly SOS note in the bottles. The scariest part about it all was the photographs were super ordinary, of families and normal people, and 2 of the notes in the bottles made no sense at all. While it was English, it was pretty much straight gibberish. None of the words made any sense in context with the other words. The 3rd bottle had a super ordinary letter, talking about what they'd been up to, something you'd send to a fairly distant relative after not speaking with them for a while. I don't really know what to think of it all. I feel like it could have easily just been someone joking around, but it was almost too strange for that. Under a church in my local town, there is this green door covering with no handle, because it's a wooden, real fake door. Legit though, it's a door with no hinges. It's meant to just stop access into there. I'd like to mention the door is on the back side of the church, and outside the church grounds. There's no road near it. One day, me and my mates saw someone had smashed the wooden door thing to pieces. As typical teenagers, we wanted to explore, but me being me, I said we should research it. In our town, there are quite a lot of tunnels linking houses and shops that are usually chained off, but a lot of them are still open and haven't been explored. This was the first time when we wouldn't have to ask a shop owner to have a look. I found that they were apparently all these ghosts, including the Blue Drum Boy, who got killed during a war in the early 11th century. My friend believes in all the paranormal stuff, so he got his cross and ghost shit ready. I packed a 500 lumen torch to light up the place and had a pack of batteries spare, as well as a walkie-talkie and all the other essentials. It was the early hours and pitch black, and we went in. Everyone was completely silent as we crept down the stairs, and suddenly we realized there was a 90-degree turn where we couldn't see the right. Everyone was scared shitless to go down first, so my mate lit a red flare and threw it in. Then we all walked in together. There was this huge room with another doorway. We looked around the first room, finding needles and blood. We carried on through the doorway and found a grate that had a ladder off it. Obviously, we were buzzing and thought, what a great idea to cut through the lock and climb down the ladder. 3 out of the 4 of us were down when the largest of us all started climbing. It was rickety and kind of rusted, and it broke when he was halfway. The exit from the ladder was a tunnel, completely dry and pitch black, but he fell and shattered both ankles. Oh, and there was a bad stench. Yeah, bad situation as we couldn't get back up the ladder, and my mate couldn't walk, and he was the biggest guy, so we had to carry him. Basically, when me and one other mate carried on, leaving the others to find help, as the walkie-talkies got no reply, we walked past rotting rat corpses, live rats, and a shit ton of blood stains. After about 30 minutes of walking, after about a mile, we found a crossroad. Straight, left, or right. Basically, left was a dead end, right was a dead end, and straight had a ladder. The ladder was rusted, and we were scared to climb it, but I climbed it, and found someone with a needle in their arm, dead. Their face was rotting, and I was about to be sick. The ladder led to identical rooms, but no lock on their grate. I went back down the ladder, got the others to come back, and we managed to get my large mate up and out and took him to the hospital. We couldn't say where we went or talk about the dead guy, because we knew it would be trespassing. We had a neighbor before who was possessed by demons. Apparently, she made a deal with a demon when she was younger, but it followed her. When she got possessed, 4 or 5 men were holding her down, but she trashed them like toys. A pastor was called, as the whole neighborhood watched, and when the exorcism started, her body twitched and spasmed. She also levitated less than an inch above the bed. The exorcism was very exhausting, and she said that she would just go with them, as in the demons, but they told her to trust in God, because if not, she would be dragged to hell. After the first day, they thought that they had moved all the demons, but some of them were still holding on to her. They did another exorcism, and finally they were all removed. They removed a total of 6 demons within her. And I also saw a news story on TV, where several students in a school in a very rural area were possessed. What's weird about this is they started speaking Latin, German, and Greek, languages that are not taught in schools here in Asia, the Philippines. I found it incredibly creepy, and is certainly one of the scariest things I've heard in my life. I spent various stretches of time backpacking and camping throughout the US, and have seen some strange things. My brother and I came across an abandoned trailer town of sorts that scared the hell out of us. We also came across a run-down and really small town out in New Mexico that seemed to have one person living in it. on the fact that there was still some food and supplies there that were just fairly fresh. We spent a couple of days there trying to find the person, just to find out why they were staying in the town, and we never found a soul. We also found the skeletal remains of an unknown number of deer, ranging from bucks to fawns, ensnared in barbed wire fencing that encompassed a 10 by 10 area in the Ozarks. A few of the skulls topped the fence posts, and there was one post in the middle of the area that had decaying deer bodies. It looked to be 2, but there were only 6 hooves jutting out of the wreckage, and they were wrapped around it. We found a dummy hanging from a tree while in the Yukon Territory of Canada, literally out in the middle of the woods. No reason for it as far as we know. We also came across a dead junkie on a road out to Olympia, obviously OD, as he had his arm tied and a needle in his hand. Eyes were glazed over and staring right ahead with his mouth slightly ajar. I need to give you a bit of background. When this occurred, I was not living the healthiest of lifestyles. I quit using heroin when I was 25 and moved to France for 5 years. I just recently moved back to the States this past summer. This is relevant because it speaks to my mindset at the time, all about how this occurred, and why I was comfortable taking the absurd risks I took. I was a drug fiend. Anyway, onto the story. When I was 20, I had moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking the distance would help mitigate my habit. It didn't. Instead, I just ended up driving to Baltimore every couple of days and buying several $100s worth of heroin, instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In the process, I got to know a lot of good people, some of them hacks. In Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates a cabbie illegally. Often they take people into the city to pick up their drugs, or just charge half the rate of a legit cab driver. I had met an older guy at a Dunkin' Donuts in Dundalk who did this. Now, I wasn't into the habit of using hacks, but one night, my ride went down a one-way street the wrong way in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. It ends up the idiot had brought his stash of pot with him. So we were arrested, and God was I pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. It ends up that not only had my friend admitted ownership of the marijuana, but the reason they'd used to search us, that his license was showing up as suspected, was bull, and my friend's lawyer had called them up on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore City with no ride and nowhere to go. Dope sick in the middle of December. They released the men and women separately, and my friend's cell phone was still off at the time when I tried to call it. It ends up he'd been released several hours earlier, but had left his phone in the truck. For anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of being arrested, they impound your vehicle. You're out of luck re-getting your vehicle back. Not to mention another couple of $100 in the hole. As I mentally ran through my list of options, I remember the hack I'd met earlier that week, and decided to give him a try. I figured that at the least, if he was still awake, I could pay him to help me cope, and drop me off at the Greyhound bus station to wait out the night. Well, I called, and not only was he up and about, but he was also only about a 10-minute drive away from where I was being released. The fact that he was still up and about at 1 in the morning may have given normal people pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead, tweaker, or some such. and wrote it off as luck. Within half an hour, he showed up, and I clambered into the long grey sedan, just grateful to be out of the cold and back on solid ground. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, the very best I can think to describe him is grey. Everything about him just grey. His vehicle was a medium dinged up grey. His hair was very longish and a deep, solid grey. Even his palace seemed grey. I remember he had the face of a postmenopausal woman. Sort of Jolie, if you know what I mean. Soft. In retrospect, the guy was creepy as all get out, but at the time, he seemed unexceptional. And really, in the drug world, there are so many weird people that unless someone comes off as blatantly volatile, you eventually learn to just ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. We managed to cop in Baltimore. There's always someone out. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound station, just wanting to get well and to curl up, till I could think about catching a bus. And he just sort of looked at me, looked down, looked back up, and then asked if I just wanted to go watch TV at his place till the buses began running. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but the man seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity, that I couldn't imagine him being a threat. And, if I'm entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. I was well beyond dope sick at this point. All my consuming thoughts were to just get straight. Taking my silence for hesitation, I remember him telling me not to worry, and he wasn't going to try anything. I ought to have mentioned that I am a 5'6", 100-pound female, 20 years old at the time, and the bus station wasn't the safest place for a tiny female like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning. That he was just trying to help. Well, I thanked him. I said sure, and we proceeded to drive out towards the county. To this day, I'm still not sure in which direction we even went in. Just that wherever it was that he lived, it was about half an hour outside of the city, and that it was not in the woods, but in a heavily wooded area. As we neared his house, he started acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off the alarm bells yet, but still. I'll never forget him saying that either the police chief or the chief's son lived in the same cul-de-sac that he did, that they were friends, and that the guy had helped him out of what turned to be a few predicaments. The house was right on a lake, with a dock in the backyard, and I have no idea what county this was in, and no one I've tried describing it to has ever been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. We pulled into his driveway, and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a McMansion than the hovel I assumed I was in for. He would go on to tell me as he parked and we walked up to his door that it had belonged to his mother, who had recently passed away. Here this ratty little man with a ratty little car in his ratty little clothes is living in an extremely well and expensive house, driving around all day and night for pocket change, and basically living in a Dunkin' Donuts. I was a bit more skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger, but at least more familiar. More in line with what I'd seen the guy do thus far. The house was covered in two things: dust and knickknacks. And when I say covered, I mean covered. Every square inch surface space was covered in a tacky little porcelain angel and dollar store crap. Shelves, tables, the top of the ginormous old box television, even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with the things. There were the obligatory dollies that all old people seem to have in spades, all of them, coated in dust and discoloured. I asked where the bathroom was, and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out at this point, and I just wanted to get straight to it in order for me to decide what to do. The first thing I did was went back to the living room, which was the first room you walked into when you came into the door. I didn't want to go any deeper into the house. I really wanted to take a look at the lock on the door and to create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't really need one. The hope was quickly dashed. The first thing the guy did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. I asked him what the pills for, and he said, to sleep. Now it's 3 a.m. At this point I have to be at the bus station by 6, at most, and we have maybe 2 hours before we need to leave. I tell him that I don't think that's a great idea, since falling asleep isn't on the agenda, that we didn't have time even for a quick nap. Well, he starts to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if we weren't so out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being December and bitter cold at this point, I'd have booked it. Instead, I sort of laughed and took the 2 pills out of his hands and stuck them in my mouth and took a sip of water, saying, "Well, what the hell?" Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to get me another glass of water, which I requested. Looking back, I shouldn't have even drunk the bloody water. I spat out the pills and shoved them in the seat of the sofa. The whole time we'd been talking about little things. Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. At this point, he starts asking me about my chemicals, about drugs. Specifically, what sort of drugs will knock someone out, but not harm them. How much you need, or what for someone. Say, for someone tiny, like myself. I try to act as if this is entirely normal conversation. At this point, it seems that my existence is dependent on whether or not I register how abnormal the entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time was that I couldn't act as if I knew anything was going on. And as time went on, which you'll see what I mean in a bit, was that I couldn't act as if I knew what was going on. That I couldn't act as if there was anything strange or alarming occurring. That he would be stupid to let me leave, and let me live, if he knew that I knew exactly what was going on here. That I need to seem like a non-threat. The whole time we are having this discussion, by the way, the guy kept trying to get behind me. At one point he succeeded and started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed, said I wasn't a fan of massages, and that I needed to run to the bathroom. When I came back, I made sure to sit on the side of the sofa that was against the wall, and I'm looking around for a phone. But I don't want to ask for one, because I don't want him to know that my cell phone is dead. Yeah, another great stroke of luck. My cell phone had died about 5 minutes after I called the creep to come and pick me up. Now this whole time, the guy had been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes, only to get back up again, walk back and forth a bit, and then of course, sit down. He'd begun talking about his mother, how she collected these knickknacks, and how she'd died, a heart attack, and how he'd been thinking about renovating the house, but hadn't had the heart to make any changes to anything yet. So he says he wants to show me something. He wants to show me the upstairs. Why I didn't run screaming out of that place I didn't know. I think part of me was still very much hoping that I was misreading the situation, and this guy was just lonely and creepy and socially maladaptive. Not actually dangerous or anything. But here we were, yet one more horror-filled trope coming into play. Creepy obsession with mother and bizarre dust-filled house, perfectly preserved in memory of her, down to the last glass that she used sitting on the kitchen table. I shit you not. And now the guy wants to show me the upstairs. He wants to show me her room. So I follow him up the stairs. At first, he makes it obvious he wants me to go up before him, but I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story, and there were 3. I never made it to the third, however, and turn off down this hallway, and he opens the first door to the left and goes in. Honestly, I'm half expecting to see the body of his dead mum lying on the bed or something, and find myself seriously relieved when I find myself standing in just one more dust-coated room full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. I remember the bed was made, and that I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down, and I obliged. What followed was the worst experience. He sat down on the end of the bed, next to me, and began talking about his mother. After a bit, he looks at me and said, "You're so beautiful. I bet little girls really like you." I tried to lead the conversation back to his mother. He gets up and walks over to the far wall of the bedroom, starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out. He asks me what I would use to knock out a child, what I would use to keep a child knocked out for long periods of time safely. I'm trying at this point to act as if I'm still on point, as if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrible. I tell him I really didn't know. I'm just a dope friend, not a chemist. He asks about heroin, and if that would be safe. At this point I've just had it, and I think he could tell. And he says, "I want to show you something." I begin to protest, and tell him that I have to use the restroom, but he insists. He pushes on the cheap wood paneling on the wall, and a large square of it swings open. He gestures inside, says he's been working on it for a few years, that it's just big enough for a small woman, but made for a child. It's a sort of cot, and there are loops on the end for rope and some other restraints, I'm sure. I noped out of the bedroom and down the stairs. I didn't run. I just told him I had to use the restroom again. While I am walking, shaking down the stairs, I pull my cell phone out of my purse and mimic dialing on it. I was lucky that he stayed behind too close up the bedroom, and that the thing in the wall, so that he didn't see my phone, wasn't even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at that point he showed up, began loudly recounting that we had transpired the evening to my friend, and I told him how I called the nice gent we had met. I'd been with my friend Tom at the time we'd met the guy, and that he had picked me up, and that I was now at his house, but we would be leaving shortly. And then I pretended that my friend had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop, and in one respect I was lucky. The guy knew I was living out of town, but he didn't know I was living 4 hours away, or that any friend of mine would have to make that hellish long trip if they were going to come and collect me. I told my friend that I'd head out for the bus station ASAP, and that I'd see him soon. I still remember the look on the guy's face as I said that. It darkened. You know the look that snotty, spoiled little kids get when someone actually dares them and tells them no? It was like that. It was like that look, but worse. There was something almost perverse about seeing it so openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I started to grab my purse and zip up my coat, all the while gibbering on about how my friend remembered him and had said to tell him hi. It seemed at the time that there were two things that were of the utmost importance at that moment. The first, to make him feel that I hadn't found him or anything he said or displayed odd. I didn't want him to think I would be some sort of threat to his plans or his well-being if he ever let me leave. Secondly, I wanted him to know that he was identifiable, and that if someone, at least someone, who could identify him, knew I was with him. This is pretty much the end of the story, although I had one more far worse encounter with the same guy a couple of weeks after. He took me to the bus station and acted shitty the entire time we were driving there. The second encounter convinced me not only that I was lucky to be alive, but that I had spent several hours in the home of a serial killer. Do I think he had done anything yet at the time that I spent at the terrifying early morning in his house? No. I think he was gearing up though, and by the second brief encounter I had with the guy, I'm positive he had. I don't know how to put it. That uncertainty he displayed me with was gone. I think by that point, he'd crossed the line. I took down his license plate number as he was leaving that morning, and I did contact a friend of mine who was a police officer, and gave him a description of the creep's house, car, his license number, first name, cell phone number, and a detailed account of what transpired that morning in his home. A year or so later, I would receive a call from the very same officer, asking if I still had a record of the info I'd given him. Unfortunately, I no longer did, and the owner of the Dunkin' Donuts on Eastern Avenue that the creep usually did frequent had no information on him. The last he'd seen of him, the creep had come by to show him a car he'd purchased. It was black and a sedan, and that's all the owner knew. I was on high alert for a week or so. I'd received a couple of sketchy calls from a blocked number, but nothing I couldn't pin on the creep. My life went back to normal. My normal, at least. And after a couple of weeks I was able to convince myself that I had exaggerated the whole encounter. After all, I was still breathing. So one day, Tom and I decided to take a trip to the city to pick up my stash for the next few days. Usually when we went to Baltimore, we'd pick up about $500 or $600 worth of scramble, 70 pills low, and this would last the two of us about 2 days, sometimes 3. I had a hell of a habit. Well, on this day in particular, we decided to pick a bit more than usual. I can't remember why, but the entire trip was cursed from the get-go. We were late leaving the shore, and there was an accident in the harbour tunnel that ended up backing up traffic for a good 3 hours. By the time we made it to eastern Baltimore, my contact had dipped. I ended up getting in touch with another guy who sold out of Dundalk, so we went down to Erdman Avenue, the same Erdman Avenue of the creep's Dunkin' Donuts. And so I had Tom park in the Goodwill parking lot, so that I could go find my guy. Most of my contacts knew Tom, But this guy I was going to meet was one of those paranoid hitters, and wouldn't serve me if he even knew Tom's truck was in the vicinity of where we were meeting. So I had to hoof it. I can't remember exactly where it was he wanted me to meet him, but I'm fairly certain that it was on Dundalk Avenue, or Merritt Boulevard, one of the large roads that runs through Dundalk like a vein. Whenever I'm in the city and I have to walk anywhere, I employ the look down, look at your feet, never look a stranger in the eye. If a car honks their horn at you, do not respond method of minding my own business. A large part of the reason I do this is the unspoken reason. It's because a lot of people will assume that you're a hooker if they see you walking. Generally, if you don't respond when they honk their horns and holler at you, after a bit, they'll probably leave you alone. And don't forget the police and the undercovers. It's their job to harass you a bit, and to see if you'll respond, to see if you're doing business or merely an unlucky member of the vehicleless tier of society. On this particular day, I remember being more than a little spooked at the absence of traffic. It wasn't a nice day. It was overcast, grey, a standard January afternoon in Baltimore. But it wasn't abnormally shitty either. There was certainly no reason for it to be so quiet. I was walking down one of Dundalk's larger roads. The traffic should have been steady. There should have been a few people shopping and walking about at least. But no. It was just me and the occasional ragtag car. I was about a mile down from the road from my meeting point, with my dealer, when a black sedan pulled up next to me. It was the creep. He opened the passenger side door from inside and told me to get in. Now I seriously considered altering this story from my point of view to make myself look like and feel like less of a retard. But so far, I've been entirely honest in my retelling of this encounter with the guy, so I'm not going to start lying. Anyway, please cut me some slack. Over the 3 or 4 weeks that had passed since the incident at his house, I'd spent a fair amount of time talking myself into believing that I had over-dramatized the whole encounter. That maybe that little room in the wall, with the cot, hadn't been what I thought it was. In short, I had tried to convince myself that I was just a heroin-addled junkie who had blurred the lines in between reality and fantasy. So when the creep pulled up and told me to get into his car, there were a lot of reasons why I did that, instead of doing what a sane person would do, which is start screaming, running, and pitching a fit and just generally noping the hell out of there. I've tried to figure out that day why I did that, and all I can say is that I'd been convincing myself that there was no way I'd actually experienced what I thought I had, and my dislike at the feeling that I'd been a giant coward. I sort of felt compelled to face the guy, and verify that no, there was nothing strange going on, and that it really had all been in my head. But at the same time, there was another dynamic at play. The fact that I was still sickeningly afraid of the creep. I remember pulling back from the open door of the car and looking around, looking at the whole lot of no one and nothing on the street, and thinking that if I didn't go willingly, he could easily run me down on his own. I told him I was busy, and I told him I was on my way to meet my guy, and he said that's fine. He'd take me the rest of the way and drop me off, that he'd even take me back to wherever I was going afterwards, if I wanted me to. So I got into the car. I was absolutely terrified. Then I fell back into the same routine I'd utilized the first time round, acting disoriented and high, harmless, and glad to see him. I asked him what he'd been up to, and he said in a perfectly monotone voice that he'd tried to call me, and why hadn't I answered. I explained that I used throwaway cell phones, and that I had acquired a new one since my minutes had run out on the other. Now I remember I said that I'd only been about a mile or less from my meeting point with my dealer when the creep pulled up. My hopes were pinned on him keeping his word, and actually taking me to where I needed to go. If that happened, I thought that everything would be okay, and that I didn't need to worry. But of course it didn't. When he blew through the light we needed to turn at, I told him he missed my stop. "Oh," he replied, "don't worry. I'll take you to where you need to go. I just want to talk to you for a minute first." I felt sick to my stomach. He pulled off Dundalk Avenue, and I could see that he was turning into one of those little parks that they have dotted throughout the city. Parks with jogging paths and a few token toys and swings for children. If I recall correctly, there was some sort of school or other government building in the background. I remember thinking that as soon as he slowed down just a bit, I was going to jump out of that car. I also remember thinking that I need to relax, that if he even thought for a moment that I was beginning to freak out, my chances of him slowing down or giving me any sort of out would be nil. You see, the whole time he had been going on about how he was looking for sedatives and wanted to get some Xanax, as well as a cocktail of other drugs. How he'd really like my help, and how he'd been scouting the park we were in at the moment, as well as other parks throughout the city and county, and how he was certain that with someone like me by his side to help lure little girls back to his house, he could fulfill his dream, he said. And here is what terrified me the most. He could use the dock behind his house to get rid of the bodies. I've never disliked myself more than I did that day. The whole time he'd been talking about all of this, I'd been doing two things. One, I had begun to slouch down in the passenger seat with my eyes almost shut, trying to act as if I'd nodded out. I could only see him a little out of the slit in the corner of my eye. The whole time he was talking about this and that, and how he'd been rooted around underfoot in front of his seat. Slowly, sneakily, as if he was trying not to make any noise. So when I could respond to him, I would make a warning gesture, like move my hand to indicate I was about to open my eyes. The last thing I wanted to do was to make him feel like he'd been caught, and that he had to pull whatever it was out immediately. The second thing I'd been doing was how I was responding to his questions. Instead of acting freaked out or upset, I was trying to act like I was on board with all of this, but not too on board. I was trying to act like I was considering it, like I had the option to do this if I wanted or not. I didn't want him to think of me as a victim, and I didn't want him to think that I was thinking of myself as a victim. I was hoping that if I acted like his peer, like a potential partner in crime, that he would treat me like one, or at least pretend to for long enough for me to leave the car safely. He was starting to circle the park when he began to slow down significantly. Through the slit opening of my eye through my eyelashes, I could see him reach as far down as he could under the front seat, all the while watching me intently to see if I'd move. I knew it was time to get the hell out of the Dodge, because whatever he had, whatever he was looking for down there, he did not want me to know about it, and that terrified me, and God was I lucky. I was lucky because at the same time that he was slowing down, another car had come out of nowhere and was slowing down next to his vehicle. He sat up, and I bolted. I just grabbed the door handle and fell out of the door and ran without ever looking back. I pulled my cell out of my purse and called my friend, and had him pick me up from one of the stores on the corner of the avenue. I was bawling, terrified at my own stupidity, at how close I knew I had come to ending up in someone's psycho dungeon. This was how he referred to the hole in the wall during the rant that day. All because I didn't listen to my instincts, or hell, just pure common sense. I cried and cried and cried, thinking about the creep and all the things he said he wanted to do to little girls. This, for all intents and purposes, is the end of my encounter with the creep. But 2 or 3 months after all of this happened, I received a phone call one day, and I didn't answer it because the number was unfamiliar. Later that week, I checked my voicemail. It was the creep. He changed his number and wanted to let me know he had finished renovating the house and wanted me to come see it. He said he put an ad in some paper and was letting out various rooms at boarding rooms for women only, and that he had some interesting ideas he wanted to talk over with me. I forwarded the new number to my police officer friend and changed my own. Despite what I said earlier when I had told the creep that my number I'd changed and I used throwaway phones, my number had never changed. I just never answered because I didn't know, and prior to our second meeting, had not bothered to set up my voicemail at that point in time. Over the years, I've tried on and off to find the creep's house. Now, with Google Maps, I may even be able to narrow down the county. The Dunkin' Donuts he hung out at every morning for years is the one on Edmond Avenue. Google Maps shows the Dunkin' Donuts with a bus stop out front, for anyone that's interested in checking it out. I still think the best bet is the owner of the Dunkin' Donuts. The creep hung out there for years, picking up business, drinking coffee, and talking to the owner.
My evening was so unremarkable that when my phone lit up with a notification, I practically lit up. Lately, I've had the habit of staying in and lounging around in my spare time. More often than not, I only socialize on other people's initiative. So, the email I received from my friend, Charlie, inviting me to do something, I didn't care about response time etiquette and straight away agreed to go. The email was short, but sweet. It read, "Hey, I just finished an escape room and it was amazing. So difficult, I bet you'll have a tough time doing it. I'm at the lobby at the end if you want to meet me. It's only in town for a short while, so you better hurry." This email was followed with instructions on how to get there. I shot a concise response that I'll be there, and threw on some going out clothes and left. It was a dark winter evening, so when I pulled in front of the large monolithic structure, Gothic in nature, it unsettled me somewhat. The building I arrived at was renowned to all who grew up in my town. Legends were told of its eerie origins around the schoolyards of my youth. Some said it was an abandoned mental facility that had one too many escapees. Others said it was home to an outcast scientific group that performed more than unsavory experiments in the confines of their abode. Whatever the truth was, this mystery added to the thrill of the setting, and in turn got me very excited for the upcoming events. I soon pulled over into the open field that was being used as a car park and made my way into the reception area. Inside, I noticed a lack of attendance in the barely illuminated lobby. The only standout feature in the rustic, unkept interior was a pristine note folded in half, then opened slightly, left tented on a small table. The light from a nearby lamp highlighting its importance. I opened the note and slowly read it. "Welcome. Your stay has already been prepaid by your friend. All you have to do is log into your email in the computer terminal to print off your entrance code. The escape room is simple. Make your way through 5 puzzle rooms, and you win. You cannot bring your phone in, so leave it at the basket behind the reception counter, and it will be looked after during your visit. When you are ready, make your way through the door marked Room 1 by inputting your entrance code. But be warned, once you enter, there's no turning back." Though I wasn't comfortable leaving my phone in an area unattended by staff, It was also unattended by customers either, so I chose to heed its advice, trying to stick to the rules, and placed it in the basket described. I then followed the instruction and used the computer allocated to print off my unique code and readied myself for a challenge. The computer looked as aged as the surroundings, making noises I hadn't heard a computer make since Windows 98. A rush of nostalgia shot through me, bringing back fond memories of my parents placing me in front of their brand new computer, clicking away at what I rightfully believed was the future. While inputting my allotted code, I found the numbers on the pad hard to press. The buttons were old and mechanical, like that of a rusted typewriter. If number pad doors existed in the time this building was built, this is how I'd imagine them. The first room was pitch black, save for a spotlight that illuminated a select cone in the middle of the room. Settled in the middle of the light was a small wooden table, which held another note, propped identically to the first. I crept my way over, making sure to take high, exaggerated strides in case an unseen obstacle stood in my way. When I safely made it to the only visible section, I pinched the top corner of the note and lifted it. This action was almost erased when I nearly dropped it in fright. The moment my fingers glanced at the thin sheet, the room burst to life. Light flooded the room in an archaic, metallic clunk. A heavy sound made my heart pound from shock, but soon settled when I saw how non-threatening the room was. The walls were adorned with terribly painted figures, a child's concept of horror. Black paint was literally used to etch the silhouette of figures with red eyes and sharp teeth. On top of the cliché visage, the painting skill left a lot to be desired. If a staff member painted it, they should have outsourced the job. If they hired someone to do it, they should demand a refund. These figures were adorned around the walls, each one in a slightly different pose to the last. Once I was familiarized with the room, I took to reading the note. Say hello to your new friend. This is the monster which is said to stalk this building. If you see him, make sure you never look at him. He's not afraid to act out if you do. This room's task is simple. Count all the teeth and input it as a 4-digit code. Good luck. Before I thought of counting, I tried to think if it was any sort of puzzle. The task was too simple for my liking, and it had my senses on edge, trying to figure out if there was a deeper meaning. I looked around the floor and the ceiling to see if there were hidden sketches I missed upon first glance. Seeing nothing else out of place, I decided to try the obvious route and started counting each pointy tooth. By my count, the total came to 119, so I used my first attempt at 0119. To my surprise, I heard the loud click of the lock snapping open, and the door slowly creaked ajar via its own hefty weight. Each door I'd seen so far was thick, and was mostly composed of raw wood. I dared not think of the scenario of being trapped in one of these rooms. I slinked my way into the next room, and the door firmly closed soon after. This room was identical to how I found the first room upon arrival. Everything was bathed in darkness, save for a lone table with a thin veil of paper in the middle. However, it felt different. Whether the darkness was unnoticeably thicker or the light was unnoticeably thinner, the room felt heavier in presence. Despite its identical appearance as Room 1, something within me whispered I had to move on to a higher stage. I crept my way to the note, making sure to avoid unseen dangers lurking in the shadow. As soon as I grasped the note, the room once again burst to life. The room wasn't too dissimilar to before, though this time it wasn't adorned by childlike scribblings. I looked around and noticed a furnishing that wasn't in the previous room. A table. Atop the table were 2 jugs and a set of scales. I furrowed my brow. This looked oddly familiar, but at that moment I couldn't place why. I read the note and studied the puzzle described. It laid out what I needed to do. On the table were 2 jugs, one that held 3 litres and one that held 5 that I could fill with a tap. I had to perfectly fill a jug with 4 litres of water and place it on the scale. I dropped my arm with the note to my side and internally slapped my forehead. I realised why this seemed familiar. This was the water puzzle from the 3rd Die Hard film, Die Hard with a Vengeance. It took me a second to remember the answer, but it was simple. Fill the 5-litre jug, then pour as much as I could into the 3-litre. This left me with 2 litres in the 5-litre jug. Then I emptied the 3-litre and poured the remaining 2 in there. After that, I filled the 5-litre again and poured the water in the remaining 1-litre space in the smaller jug, thus leaving me with 4 litres exact. It was a child's puzzle at most, and I was starting to think my friend was having me on by selling me this experience on its difficulty and challenge. I placed the jug on the scale, and the metallic click resounded from the exit door, signifying its unlocking. I begrudgingly moved on to try to get the rest of this experience over with. When I clicked into the next room, I surveyed the area. The room was a mirror of the last, darkness swallowing the room, with the only respite being the beam illuminating a single note. Though the puzzles from before left a lot to be desired, each time I entered, a chill would pass through me, the anticipation of the revealing darkness always weighing heavy on my mind. I stumbled toward the note, taking less care this time, as nothing had caught me out before. My mind was starting to get complacent with the setting. With my dominant hand, I pinched the corner of the note and slowly lifted it. Once the light beamed on, my eyes reflexively tightened. The slow revealing of my eyes opening lessened the blow of the scene before me. Along what were already grimy walls were the running of red smears. Various shades adorned the walls, some looking a fresh crimson red, others looking an age-old brown. The stark contrast from the previous inane rooms made my breath stagger in shock. In disbelief, I immediately turned to the note for answers. Welcome to room 3. This challenge might be a bit gut-wrenching. On the table behind you will be the friend which invited you here. He looks peaceful, doesn't he? Your task is simple. Use the tools provided to retrieve the key. You have the option to leave the room without it, but something tells me you might need it later. Good luck. I flipped the paper a few times, in denial that that was it. I searched with all the hope in my heart that there was more, or that there was a mistake. But there wasn't. I dreaded the reveal, but I eventually relented and turned to see if what the note said was true. It was. Behind me was the still body of my friend, Charlie. I slowly stepped over to the body, the cadaver of my friend unmoving. Around him were the overused and undercared tools that most likely came from the building, each looking like they were from medical jobs I had no idea existed. These were all placed on a large stainless steel table. It looked clinical, similar to what you'd imagine you would find in a meat factory. Robust and could handle a lot of manual labor. His arms and legs were strapped down. His skin around these leather bands had red streaks, giving the impression that my friend had been struggling around. I tried to wake him. I slapped him around, shouting at him. I tried everything in my power to wake him up. Nothing. This took me back for a second. And then it hit me. This was a test. Something you'd see in Fear Factor, where they made celebrities reach into what they thought were gore, but was really warm spaghetti. Still, there was something unnerving about cutting into something that looked so much like someone you know. The first cut I made was entirely with my eyes closed. The skin was tough and rubbery, like cutting into an uninflated basketball. However, once inside, it was easier to get around. I dug my hands in and reached for what I could vaguely recognize as a stomach, retching with each moist squish. It took a few attempts. My organ knowledge was lacking, to say the least. Even with a map, I'd have stumbled in the wrong direction a few times. Many visceral minutes later, I was popping what I assumed were pig organs, as they are some of the closest to humans you can find, and pulled out a small metallic key. Once completed, it all hit me at once, and I collapsed to the floor, seething in exhaustion. I now had empathy for all the celebrities I laughed at on those freaky challenge shows. The body above was a mess I no longer wanted to look at. After a few moments of me trying to catch my breath, a familiar click resounded around the room. I scrunched my face at this, wondering what the purpose of the key was if it wasn't used to exit the third room. Knowing I wouldn't find an answer through pondering alone, I pocketed the key and got up. Begrudgingly, I made my way to the door, not wanting it to somehow click shut if I left it too long. I was starting to tire of these games, but I encouraged myself by remembering there were only 2 rooms left. As soon as I entered room 4, I mildly vocalized my frustration. It was the same ordeal again. A dark room with a beam of light flaring in the middle. Though looking back, this frustration may actually have been compensation for the dread that filled me each time I entered. There was something chilling about the repetitive darkness, a veil which hid a new surprise each time. I crept my way over to the middle, this time not in haste, learning my lesson from the room before. I took a deep breath. I exhaled loudly as I picked up the paper, drenching the room in a dull light. This note started with a tone of urgency. Don't turn around. Don't look him in the eyes. He will try everything to get your attention. Under no circumstance should you ever give it to him. I stared at the concise note, trying to make heads and tails of it. As I pulled it from my vision, I caught a glimpse of a figure in front of me. Straight away I played along and kept my head down. Have you ever reacted in a way that was completely out of your control? I had one of those moments. For some reason, out of a strange reflex, I started giggling. A giddy feeling ran through me as I nervously kept my head down and my eyes closed. I felt something waving past my face, feeling like a hand swishing up and down right in front of my closed eyes, checking if I could see. At this, I tightened my eyes, making sure to not even look at the dark silhouette through my eyelids. I was trying my best to play along. Throughout this, I still couldn't figure out if I was enjoying the tension or if my laughter carried genuine fear. This all changed when I heard a voice. "Hey, it's just me. We had to go in this whole time." The familiar tone and vibe calmed me all at once. It was the unmistakable sound of my friend, Charlie. It was all starting to add up in my head. All the events, the poorly thought out early rooms that were sold as an amazing experience, the strange yet surreal room involving Charlie's body. He set this up, and it got me good. I burst out laughing in a sign of defeat, trying to overshadow my embarrassment and not picking up on things sooner. My head still hung down, having made myself comfortable at that angle. My eyes squinted open, and straight away, shot closed. It was less than a second, but that was all I needed. In front of me were the thin, ashen legs of something not my friend. The thin, raisin-skin pillars looked decrepit, an age I couldn't comprehend in human years. It reminded me of the poorly drawn sketches from Room 1. I started taking back the comments of the art style in my head, now thinking it was possibly due to the lack of study rather than the lack of artistic talent. The voice giggled and started to talk more. "Hey, don't ignore me. It's over. It was just a joke. You can look up now." "It's okay. I think I'll keep my eyes closed, just in case." Wasn't my best improv, which was picked apart immediately. Just in case? Just in case of what? There's nothing going on. Just open your eyes. The frustration at the end of that statement revealed something more than just anger. It carried a tone no longer attributed to my friend. In fact, it no longer attributed to anything human. A glimpse under the mask of what was really in front of me. I nervously kept my mouth closed, trying to fixate on my eyes remaining as tight as possible. A hand gently rested on my shoulder, and a voice soothed its way into my left ear. "Son, it's okay. We're here. You can let this go now." It was feminine, and a voice I hadn't heard in an age. My mother's. Another voice echoed into my right ear, this one much deeper. "Hey kid, you did well, but it's over now. We're proud of you. Look at us so we can greet you properly. It's been too long." This voice was unmistakably my father's, something which took me by complete surprise. I was shocked, my mind reeling at the scenario unfolding before me. It had been so long since I've heard those voices, many years since I touched them. I wanted to believe it so hard that they were there, because in reality, they had been dead for almost 5 years. Tears welled up in my eyes, loosening the iron grip I forced on them. They quivered with a hope I all but knew was false. But the possibility, that glimmer of hope, tore me apart inside. It had been so long, so many years. They didn't stop talking either. They whispered words of pride, of encouragement, of kindred love. Still, my eyes gripped closed. Inside, my heart was pulling them open. My brain was pressing them closed. Their words didn't stay positive for long. Similar to the emotional outburst as before, they contorted into twisted words of malice. You always disappointed us, and you can't even look us in the eyes? Shame. 5 years, and you don't want to see us? What kind of coward did we raise? These were just the lighter ones. These cut deep. I cannot describe the surreal feeling that was swirling inside me. The urge to resist was eternally getting harder. My breathing picked up. A strong feeling of panic crawled around my body, each part shaking wherever it touched. A shiver of fear and pain. This all came to a head, and they were screaming in my ears, each side of me, belting at me to just look at them. They moved around, sometimes focusing at one point in front of me. When the two voices intertwined, I swear I saw the soft glow of red flare across my closed eyes. However, this was more bearable than what they turned into. The screams softened to pleas, which fell into begging, then eventually dissolved into quiet whimpers. These wordless sounds tore my heart more than the loss I felt at the death of my parents. The tears dripped from my face as silence took over. First, it was a deathly quiet. But when the realization came that not only would I never hear those voices again, but how twisted the last words I'd ever hear their voice in, I fell down and bawled. Between sobs and the silence, an all too familiar click echoed around the room. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to recompose myself. Even when I finally chose to move on, the weight of pain still sat heavy in my chest. I didn't understand what was going on, but all I wanted in that moment was to get it over with. Motivation screaming at me that the next room would be the last, but dread whispering that it may only get worse. I entered room 5 and was faced with the same scene which I had learned to fear. Darkness, save for my trigger, centered in the room. I composed myself once more and readied myself for the worst. Each step I took toward the note, a feeling of terror pulled at my ankles. Eventually, I was dragging my heels, forcing myself to face the note. Part of me wanted to pull the band-aid and yank the note to my face and get it over with. The other part wanted to enjoy the peace of darkness before I bathed myself in whatever was coming next. Sadly, the silence couldn't last forever, and I gently picked up the note. Upon immediate contact, the room as before lit up, the light blinding me for a second, as at that point I had adjusted to the darkness in my procrastination. I held the note right in front of my eyes. I fear that whatever was in the room couldn't hurt me if I couldn't see what it was, similar to the comfort of pulling a blanket over all your limbs as a kid. Secretly, everyone knows it'll do nothing, but the irrational comfort was better than nothing. I squinted at the words and slowly made them out. Welcome to the last room. Don't worry, this is a simple one. If you have the key, just leave the room. If not, you will have to take the second option. Just lie down in the bed and fall asleep. Whether you wake up depends on whoever you invite next. I was taken back at how simple this seemed. Just leave or stay? It was clear what the obvious choice was. I looked around the room, and upon a quick glance, I couldn't see anything indicating a key. I looked around the room, and upon a quick glance, I couldn't see anything indicating a key, nor something I could hold a small item. My surroundings were simple. The room was as dingy as the ones before. In front of me, in the centre of the room, was a small wooden table, identical to the previous one. To my side was a metal table, with nothing but a few strips of leather on top. Where I came from was a rustic-looking wooden door, beat up with time. In front of me was a different door. This one looked reinforced, heavily. If this place truly was an old asylum, this was probably what held the lunatics at bay from the rest of the civilized world. If I were to take my shoulder at it for 100 years, it probably wouldn't budge. My only chance of escape was the key. I looked around again, this time more intently, and a sense of familiarity came up. I did a double take and stared at the only out-of-place item in the room, the metal table. A nostalgia gently reminded me of an identical scene from before. As I studied it, I saw a mix of gore lay stained on it, as if it had seen years of use in a meat factory. My stomach sank as I pieced together what happened before. The fake body of my friend I had cut into may not have been as fake as I'd thought. My hand shook as I slowly reached down into my pocket, barely able to grip the item I wanted to deny getting. Even when I only saw a glimpse of it, I saw the reality of what I'd done. What was once a pristine metal key was coated in a thin layer of gore. What I once comfortably felt was fake Halloween blood was now screaming at me the regret I'd carry for the rest of my life. I was in a pale state of shock when I gently wrote it clean, hoping that things unseen would hide away the painful memories they carried. When it got to a usable state, I gently lowered it into the keyhole, and an easing click sounded as it gave no resistance to twisting. The final words of the previous note echoed through my mind, deflecting all denial I hoped to cling on to. Whether you wake up depends on whoever you invite next. Charlie. He probably saw who invited him to this cursed place. He probably never had the delusion I had of the cadaver being fake. He probably left room 3 without the key, leaving him to the mercy of the fail state of room 5. A fate I so luckily avoided through my ignorance, but an ignorance I couldn't keep through the revelation of the final rules of the game. I was a ghost when I entered the lobby once more. The same room that started the event was a place I wanted to put behind me and never see again. I glimpsed the reception desk with a small note next to what I recognized to be my phone. I waddled over, numbness making walking a harder task than it should have been. I pocketed my phone quickly, the comfort of communication a warming feeling in the cold mindset I was stuck in. Hesitantly, I read the note. Unfortunately, this one held no malice. Congratulations on succeeding. You are one of the lucky few who have successfully navigated this escape room. Make sure to tell your friends and family to play. But shh, don't tell anyone about the secrets you've learned tonight. You don't want to spoil the game for potential players. If we have to remake the game, we'll make sure you are our primary play tester. Thank you for playing. The way the note was written had such a positive vibe, made me sick. Whoever ran this obviously took immense pleasure in the whole thing and wanted to protect it at all costs. It didn't take a genius to see the obvious threat if I were to report this, though the way it presented itself as being ran by people left me confused. My mind briefly wondered at how something so insane like this could be ran by anything human was beyond me. I counted my blessings of survival and left, clinging on to the victory of living. When I entered my car, I reflexively checked my phone for the time. I had left around 8 in the evening, and it was now just past 9. The worst pain of my life that would haunt me for the remainder of my hopefully short days could be chalked down to just over an hour. Such a strange thought to dwell on. On top of spying the time, I also saw a notification that was recent. An email from my sister's boyfriend, whom I was messaging not too long ago, talking about meeting up soon. What confused me at first was that it was a reply to an email I never sent, so I checked that first. It was simply written, and to my dismay, I recognized nearly every word used. Hey, I just finished an escape room and it was amazing. So difficult, I bet you'll have a tough time doing it. I'm at the lobby at the end if you want to meet me. It's only in town for a short while, so you better hurry. Bring Sally too. The room needs a volunteer for room 3. She'll have a blast too. This was followed by the same instructions on how to get there. It was identical to Charlie's email to me, with the addition for someone to fill my role. I racked my brain, trying to figure out how they got in my fingerprint-secured phone. But then my mind drew to the instruction telling me to sign into my email to start the game. I hastily went to call him as fast as I could, to try my hardest to stop him. However, the phone just rang through. I left a voicemail urgently telling him to not leave and to call me back. Knowing no one really checks voicemails, I swiped back to the email to try and see if he would see that first. Before I typed my response, I lowered my phone in defeat. Sent at just before 9 p.m, he messaged me. Yo, me and Sally just got here. She's just going to another room to be prepped for a role. I'm excited. I'm being told to leave my phone at the front desk, so I'll talk to you later. See you at the lobby. I turned on my car and drove home. My New Year's started with a bang. Literally. I didn't feel like I was driving fast, but perception can be a bit disoriented after a few units of alcohol. I've always been someone who fervently refused to drive under the influence. However, it was late in the New Year's Eve, and the roads were especially empty, and I had no other place to stay. I didn't fancy Uber or a taxi, because I had made the stupid decision to drive there, and didn't want to taxi back to pick up my car. I'd almost made it back. I was careful throughout most of my journey, but when I hit the country roads, I got complacent. A patch of wet mud slipped a wheel, and soon my car was tumbling over and over around a field. After that, I remember things in flashes. Lights flickering across my face, people in high-vis clothing shouting, urgent screaming to others who moved fast at his words, more lights and a blaring siren. When my mind started to soothe into a constant stream of time, I was being pushed through the many double doors of a hospital, the sterile smell of the building filling my senses, mixed in with a copper smell of my own blood. Before I even stopped, I knew this was going to be rough. All the while, a persistent thought ran through my head. Those annoying rumours that I was told when young, that if you're an organ donor and you show up as a wreck, they're more likely to harvest your insides than treat you. I always ignored them and signed up, knowing it was the right thing to do. But a small seed of annoying doubt flickered in my mind in my stressed state. In my head, I felt fine, the adrenaline of the situation casting a wave of denial over me. In my head, I felt like I was still a functional person. I tried to prove it by getting up, but my body didn't listen, no matter how hard my mind screamed. I settled down after testing my limits, knowing I had little vision through my half-open eyes and hearing through one ear, and for now, this was all I had. A niggling fear that this would be the life I would be resigned to for the rest of my life. When still, everything still felt in motion. My senses battered, vertigo swimming in my head as I saw doctors and nurses rushing. I was comforted at this, until they all stopped in unison. A niggling fear setting in as to why they stopped during such an important time for treatment. A new figure had joined the fray. A man in a formal black suit. Despite the whines of the machines linked up to my body, no one made any progress with treatment while he was around. He spoke in an authoritative tone, though I could not hear the exact words he was saying. What I did hear was the doctor protesting to whatever he was demanding, uttering the phrase, "No, we can treat him." A hopeful phrase to me, which fell on deaf ears. Suddenly, the fear of secret organ harvesters for rich clients swam back up my spine. The room fell silent, quiet enough for me to just about hear the words spoken by the mysterious figure told in a humming tone. He stated that, on paper, I was a goner, but then mentioned something about a study I signed up for, before silence fell once more. After a brief period of pondering, the doctor ushered the nurses and other attendees away, and they were quickly replaced with more official-looking figures in suits. I tried screaming for help, feeling that everything about the situation was wrong, but all that came out were barely audible wheezes, which dissipated into the air, no one taking notice, -1. The doctor, a look of defeat as he turned away in shame and fear. I panicked inside. In this heightened state, I remembered what he was possibly referring to. While studying in university, there was a small campaign to make an extra bit of cash, to sign up for an experiment by, quote, selling my body to science. The way they worded it was that it would only really happen in death. It seemed like free money at the time, and most people were selling their plasma at this point for food money, so the idea of signing away my body past death never seemed like a bad idea at the time. I wouldn't be doing anything with it anyway, though at the time, I imagined death would be much later in life, and more importantly, I'd be actually dead. Instead, I was now being carted in a helpless state to the roof of the hospital building, mistaken for a brain-dead patient, where a blackout helicopter was waiting. I was rushed in, where a few medical attendees kept me stable throughout the rough air ride. Any comfort I had through this rough ride was drained from me when I no longer saw the lights of civilization through the window slat I could peek through. Wherever I was flown to, it was completely out of town. I was still conscious through the flight, though I no longer wanted to be. My waking life now, a nightmare that I wanted to drift away from in the unconscious. In a haggard state, I was pulled from the helicopter and dragged through more long corridors. The calming, clean hospital appearance from before, replaced by these suited men in a sterile gunmetal-style building. I recognized the room I was dragged into as barely an operating room. What I just about recognized was overwhelmed by what felt more like a military base. The attending doctor spoke to me, which shocked me. I figured they accidentally thought I was brain dead up to this point, and they optimistically felt I was okay to experiment with. The fact that he acknowledged my consciousness sickened me. No longer did I feel this was a terrible misunderstanding, now knowing it was directly them taking advantage of my helpless state. I was put under, and finally able to escape the conscious hell I was brought into. I had no concept of time to determine how long I was put under, though there were more pressing matters that came to mind when I awoke. Slowly, I looked around my surroundings. I was in a comfortable living room, untouched, yet furnished and ready to be used. What didn't feel welcoming was the fact that it wasn't my home. I slipped up, slowly, my form hesitant to move. Apprehensive, I grabbed at myself, checking to physically feel if anything had changed. And to my shock, something had. My stomach and torso area were wrapped tightly with bandages. It was almost like a second skin, it was that tight and seamless. However, that didn't explain why I felt so emaciated. I rubbed around in disbelief, hoping it was a trick of the mind. But when my arm easily reached around my waist to my spine, I confirmed there was something horribly wrong with my form. When I pressed around, what remained felt dense, yet soft, similar to a stiff memory foam mattress. I stumbled to the kitchen area, struggling to compensate with my now drastically lower body weight, and tried to drink to parch my dry mouth, a stress relief in my past life. However, as soon as I tried to swallow the liquid, it shot back up my throat and out my mouth. My body rejected the drink. I tried once more to the same effect. Panicked, I looked around for answers, which came in the form of a note neatly folded on the dining room table. With nimble fingers, I pried open the paper, which released some more contents. I chose to read first. The note spoke of the deal I'd made in university and gladly told me that their experiment was a success. The experiment they performed was a full internal organ extraction. I was gleefully informed that I no longer had to eat, drink, or sleep. The only stipulation was that I was to remain with them for further testing, and reminded me that this was what I signed up for. My breathing picked up. I scooped up the papers that fell, which was a currency not familiar to me. These notes were very bland compared to anything I was used to. They almost looked counterfeit, but even counterfeit money attempted to look real. Each one displayed an unknown symbol to me, followed by a number. I stumbled outside and looked around. There were people wandering the street. Some were like me, and others with bizarre additions. New arms where an arm shouldn't be. Strange combinations of what looked to be siblings, connected at intervals along their bodies. There were kids playing in a yard, each a disturbing concoction of parts. I looked further down the street and saw a building which stood out between the stereotypical suburban housing that lined the road. It was a small complex that looked like a shop. A familiar symbol branded on the side, the same one on the notes. From there, I turned my head further, seeing the tall, foreboding wire fencing surrounding the happy suburban homes. The ugly truth encapsulating the beautiful lie these people lived in, where I now lived in. Security personnel lined many points. Any form of escape would be a pipe dream at most. I looked back at the people, living their lives in this one strip of houses. I studied them, looking beyond their bizarre features and twisted appearances. There was not a single smile. Each person carried a look of defeat on their faces. Their actions carried an air of acceptance. As ashamed as I am to admit, I went through that rebellious teen phase in my youth. Whatever my parents asked of me, I wanted nothing more than to do the opposite. They were your typical hard-working cookie-cutter parents, and I was adamant on being the dark sheep of the herd. This applied to everything. Music-wise, they listened to oldies like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. I steered towards music they didn't like, heavy music like Korn and Slipknot. They wanted me to do well in school. I dossed all day and always had my teachers having words with them about my behaviour. This carried over to my fervent obsession with body modification. They liked clean skin and heads devoid of metal. I wanted tattoos and piercings in every spot possible. I would ask every day for a small piercing here or a tattoo there, knowing that the only way it would be possible at my age is if I had their written consent, something they fervently denied every time, their reason being that it would be a slippery slope to getting more and more. As you can imagine, this denial only made me want it more. I spent a lot of my free time hanging out with other like-minded kids my age at the local skate park. As you can imagine, looking back, I was a walking cliché. It was there that someone approached my friends and I. He was a scruffy, but not homeless-looking man. The stoner look, if I had to label it. He was polite in his demeanour, but he wasn't too alienating to a bunch of adult-hating kids. He pitched something to us, and it was something that was music to our ears. He explained he was training to be a body piercer and wanted some volunteers to get some free work done. We obviously kept our composure, but I could tell we were all jumping in strides inside. He led us over to his makeshift workshop in his van. His tools were simple: a clean-looking piercing kit, which he thoroughly cleaned between each use, some cream which he said was numbing, yet to me never felt like it worked, and a whole tray of these small studs which all looked the same. They were very nondescript at a distance, and not much to look at up close. A simple, off-gold yellowish ball, which he pitched as something you could hide easily with their near skin tone shade. He also gave us very specific care instructions. He lectured us to never take them off for at least a week, and to wipe them gently with clean water each night. We attentively listened, a feat in itself in my eyes. After the first week, we were free to swap them out with whatever we wanted. The final instruction was to never tell anyone. Since he was after an official job, he didn't want to tarnish his reputation at the idea of back alley work. We agreed to all his words, feeling like we'd get in as much trouble with our parents, and he happily prepped for work. One by one, we lined up and told him what we wanted. Due to the excitement of the situation, a lot of people dropped their regard of getting caught and opted to go all out. My friend got his ears done and his nose. Another got snake bites on his lip and a few in each ear. Another got 3 on his left ear. Personally, my parents' lecturing had subtly sunk in, and when finally in a situation I dreamt of, I got cold feet. So I simply got my right ear done, and that's it. A light order compared to the rest. After we finished, the man thanked us for the experience and went on his way. We laughed afterwards at how he thanked us, like we were doing him a favour, when in reality, we felt like we got the most out of the situation. I had long hair at the time, so I just kept it over my right side when I went home, and relished that evening in the knowledge of my secret rebellion. That night, I secretly cared for my new joy as the man instructed, and made sure not to sleep on my right side that night. I rested easy that night, smug with the satisfaction of finally getting something I wanted. The next day, I had almost forgotten to hide my secret in time before walking downstairs to eat breakfast. My parents figured out something was up, but they most likely chalked up my weird behaviour to how I always was around them. Still, I used all my power to try to convince them otherwise. Throughout the meal, I sometimes twitched a little, a tiny stinging pain occasionally flashing from my right ear. I covered well though, and they let me go on my way to school. All through school, I did nothing but show off my new metal. Some were in awe, others in response flashed their own matching yellow studs, which we subtly acknowledged in a kindred way, silently sharing our knowledge about the secret worker. To aid the secret, we worked hard to not be caught by the teachers. Sure, we could try lie and say we had our parents' permission, but no one wanted to risk it, especially since we revered this mysterious man which travelled through whispers. This carried on for the first few days, until it started hurting a little. One evening, even though I had done everything I was told, I struggled to sleep. Not just because of the slight stinging pain emanating from my right ear, but because of the strange sound I felt like it was making. They were infrequent at first, but each time a flare of pain came, it felt like a strange rubbing sound came every time I got a stinging sensation. I desperately wanted to tell my parents in panic, however, knew the repercussions would be severe. I chose to ignore it, and hoped it was just a part of the healing process. The next day, everyone who had a piercing confided in each other about this strange feeling. Unanimously, we all suffered from the same symptoms. Some were even missing from school that day, absent under the pretense of feeling ill. We knew something was up, and handily accepted the suggestion that they were infected. We all googled the best way to treat an infected piercing. The sites instructed us to not use anything heavy like alcohol or hydrogen peroxide. A relief, as coming across chemicals like that would be near impossible in the middle of a school day. They told us to wash out the area with salt water and to not remove the piercing, as the hole can close up. Something that echoed what the man told us when telling us to keep them in for a week. We all took up the routine and hoped that it would be the solution we were looking for. That night was restless. No matter what position I lay in, a painful itching sensation overtook my right ear. I would try to resist all I could. However, no matter how hard I tried, I would find myself picking away at it with my fingernails. Occasionally, I'd look down at my hands after a small scratching session and see soft yellow crust dug under my fingernails, dripping pus sliding down my digits. Every time I agitated it, it'd feel like it carried on in motion, spinning in my ear, despite me no longer touching it. A disturbing twitching circulating from a part of me which I never knew could move. I composed myself for my final solution, a martyr act in order to rectify the situation. I made the decision to tell my parents. I approached them sheepishly, pride tucked like a tail between my legs. After a few I told you so's from them, they opted to take a look. However, upon a mere glance, panic washed over them, which they visibly wore on their faces. My dad rushed to grab our coats and car keys, and my mother stood by me, attempting to calm me down at my confusion. The pain intermittently came and went, and in my flustered state, it rose in frequency. My dad yelled at us that he was ready. However, at this, my ear suddenly exploded in red-hot pain. No longer did it come in waves. It was now a constant burning rush of hurt. I screamed, wordlessly displaying the feeling that I had. My mom grabbed me and tried to soothe me as my legs weakened, and my dad rushed in trying to see what was going on. Neither of them knew what to do. For a moment, they froze, and that was all it took. The pain suddenly exploded into a quick relief, like the feeling when warm water finally leaves your ears after a session of swimming. The soothing warm liquid ran down my neck, and a wash of calm came over me. However, this was not the case for my parents. My panic transferred to them. My mother flung back in fear, retching in a mix of wanting to scream, yet attempting with all her might to keep it in. And my dad grabbed the nearest object he could find and rushed at me. I froze in shock until he came a few inches to me and stopped. My dad then went into a stalker mode and slowly trotted around in search of something, which left me confused. I stuttered out my feelings, which at first they both ignored. When my dad stopped intently moving in defeat, my mother's shoulders slumped down, and they were both back to normal. I repetitively asked them what happened, and finally they relented. Apparently, when I felt the relieving burst, my earlobe had in fact popped. However, from the piercing emerged a strange little bug, which immediately ran to cover like an exposed cockroach. My mom tended to my ear, still preparing me for the hospital, and I took a quick chance to glance my ear in the mirror on the way out. The lower skin was almost completely gone. The doctors confirmed it was eaten away from the inside. From the gore my parents scooped up that was tested, no metal was found. What remained was mostly my DNA, mixed with what appeared to be the genetic makeup of an unknown insect's egg. From the moment he was born, I've always loved my son, Christian. For the last 6 years, it's just been him and I, a dynamic duo. His mother left us, not willingly that is. She passed away on the operating table after a difficult birth. It's sad, but this is more common than people think. However, no matter how much you hear that, you never expect it to happen to you. One of those eerie statistics that people rattle, which you don't think about until it hits you in the face. It was odd. When she died, she was serene, right until the end. She was fixated on making sure our son was born with no complications. It was almost like she knew it would happen. She accepted all her responsibilities and pushed through until the bitter end. She was graceful in death as she was in life. I miss her. Since then, I knuckled down. I had the responsibility of raising my son and maintaining the household all by myself. My family helped at times, but I couldn't expect them to fill any parental roles, so almost all responsibilities fell on me. I always did them though, not just for him, but for her. I tried my best. I worked so hard to raise my son to be the perfect child. I gave him everything I could, whilst never spoiling him. I taught him good values, and tried to align his moral compass in the right direction. He was an angel, as was the feedback all the teachers gave while he grew up. This is why it was a shock to me when he started acting up not long after his 6th birthday. I racked my brain, trying to figure out what went wrong. I questioned if it was the kids he was hanging out with, or maybe an inadequate teacher. Either way, it was becoming more and more frequent that I was being called to listen to complaints from his teacher. The feedback was mind-blowing. I heard of things I could never imagine my son doing in a million years. There were reports from his teacher that he would hit other kids, not sharing books and class equipment, and even name-calling. These were things I fervently taught him not to do, which saddened the teacher as he had to confirm what they were saying was true. I left in shock. I was in a heavy-set denial about the whole thing. These were all behaviours he had never had any problem with before, and were things I always made sure to spend time teaching him not to do. I felt that none of this was my fault, and if they were true, it had to have originated somewhere else. When I took him home, I lectured him in a roundabout way. As I'd explained things that were wrong to do, he was the sweetest thing. He'd listen with an attentive smile, agreeing with every point I made. Making others feel bad is not good. Make sure to help out others who need help. Always be kind, and people will be kind to you in return. He said he'd do what he was told, and I was confident he'd be fine. But he never was. No matter how much I drilled good values into him, I'd be pulled aside every so often and told of the heinous things he'd done in school. I was sickened by some of the stories told, but every time I'd come back to Christian, he was the nicest kid in the whole world. Either they were lying to me, or he was only good when I was around. One factor was eliminated when his main teacher left. I felt that if the problem was him, this would be his fresh start with someone who cared. But they never did. They only got worse. I was called in to look over his art from class. Without getting into too much gruesome detail, they were disturbing. I don't know how a child conveyed such dark emotions with such simple abstract pictures, but he did. This wasn't a one-off either. It became so frequent that to save both the teachers and my time, he just saved them up and we'd review them at the end of the week. Each picture was unique in its own sense, conveying a pain that I never knew someone so young could simulate. I would try bringing this up with Christian, subtly at first, then progressively more on the nose, until I was confronting him about it. Each time, he'd have a passable reason for everything. The drawings were often obscure, with the darker details being seen through the lens of artistic interpretation. In other words, he claimed they were the simple shapes and colours that lay on the page, not the twisted amalgamations of pain and suffering that could be compared to Dali crossed with Picasso. The art was easier to explain than the behaviour. With each meeting, I would be told about the various forms of acting out Christian did. He hit other kids when the teacher wasn't looking. He would pull on girls' hair, spit at people he didn't like. He was never seen by an adult, but the frequency of these complaints from the other students made it more and more believable. This all culminated to the teacher confronting me earlier than our weekly meeting. He informed me that my son, for the first time, drew blood. Usually his demeanour was calm. However, that day, the teacher was frantically ranting at me. In his exasperated tone, he told me my son had bitten another kid, drew blood, and alluded that he tried drinking it. He went on to call him a demon and he should be burned, let alone expelled. I was shocked, and it told me one very important thing. He hated my son. This explained everything. How his art had a much higher degree of talent than a 6-year-old should be able to produce. That it seemed like the evidence was planted. How his behaviour was never reported by any other teachers and only came from these unverified complaints from other students. And how the other kids still seemed to talk to my son like nothing was wrong. This got heated to the point that the head teacher had to get involved. We both explained our sides and left it to her to make a decision. Either my child really was a demon who was somehow gaslighting the teacher with comic book villain level torment, or my son was being victimized by an inadequate teacher. She went off to contemplate action, and for a while it was left at that. During my next meeting, in which I heard some more egregious actions my son supposedly did, which I didn't pay much mind to anymore, the headmaster came to an agreement. My son would see a behaviour specialist. She told us she found someone who could pick up on a child's behavioural patterns just from a simple conversation, and that if my son was lying, he'd know. To me, this was perfect. A third-party opinion that could almost guarantee the truth. I was confident, to say the least. I agreed in a heartbeat. I told Christian about it, preparing him the same way any parent prepares their kid for the dentist or a test. I told him of the importance to be good, but to also be himself and relax. Normally, he was on board with whatever needed to be done. However, this time, he was against it. He argued that he had a bad feeling, but I assured him that everything would be fine, and sadly we couldn't refuse. It was necessary. Though Christian wasn't happy, he eventually relented, but not before voicing his disdain towards me. I just accepted it as that kid hate that parents get when they don't get their way. Christian went into the meeting. It was scheduled to be an hour, but only 15 minutes later, he popped out ready to leave. A smug smile plastered across his face. Christian was itching to go, but I was called in to see the psychiatrist to Christian's protests. The psychiatrist sat me down and got straight to the point. He looked frazzled, like he had aged years since I saw him only minutes ago. He muttered out that he was special. I was shocked at this. I started to defend his odd behaviours and that he shouldn't be put into special needs, but he reiterated what he meant. He meant special. I was confused at this, a confusion which was never answered as he moved forward. He told me Christian is not normal and never will be. Not only that, things will only get worse. However, he was willing to take him off my hands and my loss would be heavily compensated. He ended that this would be for his own good. I was stunned at this egregious offer. I was horrified that another human being would even think to make this kind of statement, let alone a professional. What made it worse was that he put it forward like he was doing me a favour. I promptly told him where he could stick it and stormed out. On the way out, he tried to hand me his business card, which I ignored as I walked away. I grabbed my son and promptly left. After all this, I felt bad for Christian. I decided I would treat him on the way home to some ice cream. Even eating his favourite dessert, he was still mad about everything. And he hadn't even heard what I heard. I couldn't imagine how he felt in that moment. I tried to ask him how it went. However, at the smallest start to conversation, he went off on me. He accused me multiple times of being with them. I tried to ask who they were, but he said that I knew. I told him I wasn't with anyone, that I would always be there for him. He called me a liar. I couldn't help but nervously eat my ice cream, trying to think of a way to calm him. While lost in thought, Christian uttered one last statement with a tone of finality, to never give him to them. As he did so, a horrible taste overcame my senses. I spat out my ice cream immediately, continuing to spit more after to try and wash away the taste. What I put in my mouth was chocolate ice cream. What came out was something that could only be described as looking like chocolate ice cream. My heart started racing. This was the first moment where I started questioning if I was wrong about my son. But after that stunt, I knew to keep my mouth shut and not say anything out of line. I simply asked if he did that, and in a smug tone, he said no. After leaving the store with a hefty gift card as compensation for our inconvenience, to the confusion of the staff members, we went home. From then on,